This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Good morning. It is 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'd go and say a special welcome as well to everybody who is enjoying this programme for the first time on YouTube, where we will now be broadcasting our morning pontifications in their full entirety. So welcome. Does that mean I have to become more aware of the camera, do you think? Do I have to start looking down the barrel? I just adjust the microphone. This could end badly. Seriously, some of the little gestures that I like to indulge in on a routine basis do not deserve to be broadcast to a wider audience. But in for a penny, in for a pound. 4 minutes after 10 is the time. The state of our schools was concerning us, of course, on Friday, notably this so-called RAC, this concrete that has been deployed in schools for decades. That is not the story. The story, of course, is the failure of the government to address the known problem. And in fact, I don't know what you were like at school, whether or not. For me, it was either Songs of Praise, Antiques Roadshow, or Last of the Summer Wine. So I was a weekly boarder for quite a long time. But even when I was bored at what we used to call full boarder, when you're there all the time, you still get weekends off. You still don't have to go to lessons on Sunday. And the theme tune from any one of those three programmes was enough to set my stomach flipping at the thought of having to go back to the classroom the next day. Do you remember that? Songs of Praise, Last of the Summer Wine, or Antiques Roadshow. That would the opening bars of either of the, and they're all quite memorable theme tunes. The opening bars of any of those three theme tunes would come over the television, and you'd say, "Oh God, back to school tomorrow." The government seemed to be doing that last night. I think it was 8:10 when the Department of Education issued a diktat, an instruction that all schools need to fill in a form to establish whether or not they are in need of help in rebuilding. What's remarkable about this story, truly remarkable, is that in 2021, according to a retired civil servant who was very senior in the Department of Education at the time, in fact, he essentially ran the Department of Education for 4 years until the middle of 2020, it was Rishi Sunak's express decision to starve these schools of the funding needed for rebuilding. In fact, and this is a rare intervention from Jonathan Slater, the permanent secretary at the DFE from 2016 to 2020. They went to him telling him they needed more money to rebuild schools, and he responded by cutting the repair budgets even further than they had been cut already. And he has gone on the record today to accuse ministers of a political decision to prioritise new free schools over repairing dangerous buildings. Once again, the fetishisation of the free market causes, well, it has consequences, sadly, beyond the pages of the Daily Telegraph or the denizens of Tufton Street. This is what happens when you prioritise a sort of bogus ideology or a fetishisation of free market values over political reality. Incredibly, all roads lead to the same place at the moment, because this is, I warned you on Friday, I was worried that I was beginning to sound like the kid in The Sixth Sense. But guess who got rid of this chap from the Department of Education in 2020 when he got in at Downing Street? Someone who was previously working at the Department for Education, a chap you've probably heard of called Dominic Cummings. So the civil servants responsible for running the Department for Education go to the Chancellor of the Exchequer and say, we need more money to repair schools, not least because of the autoclaved aerated concrete crisis that is already unfolding, and that has led to the abrupt closure and disruption of more than 100 schools days before the new term starts today. And he turned around and said no. Not only did he turn around and say no, but when officials said they need 300 to 400 schools a year to be rebuilt, and complained that ministers only agreed to fund 100 a year, he said they came back and made the situation even worse. We weren't just saying there's a significant risk of fatality. We were saying there's a critical risk to life if this programme is not funded. Labour already accusing Rishi Sunak of putting children's lives at risk. It's a remarkable moment. We will, I promise you, move towards a phone-in a minute, but I just want to get all the facts in front of you because, well, so few people bother trying these days. Here is. I mean, the sort of. I'll have a little look in Idiot's Corner in a minute. Here are the facts of the matter. Officials recommended that 300 to 400 schools a year needed to be rebuilt. Right. The head of the department said, we knew what was needed. We knew that a proper school rebuilding programme was going to be required. Otherwise, these sort of panics would take place. Right. Point number 2. Michael Gove cancelled Labour's schools rebuilding programme. I think that's even what it was called. And it passed the Ronseal test, rebuilding schools programme. Michael Gove, it was one of the first things he did when he got into the Department of Education in 2010, of course, joined by, altogether now, Dominic Cummings. One of the first things he did was to abandon Labour's schools building programme, leaving precisely these problems on the horizon. As the problems hoved ever closer, the civil servants went to ministers and indeed to the then Chancellor, a chap you probably heard of, Rishi Sunak, and said, we need to rebuild 300 to 400 schools a year. And they turned around and said, no, you can have 100. We'll fund 100 a year. And we weren't, this is the crucial line, I think, we weren't just saying there's a significant risk of fatality. We were saying there's a critical risk to life if this programme is not funded. Here it comes. While I was the permanent secretary, in 2018, a concrete block fell from the roof of a primary school. So it wasn't just a risk, it was actually starting to happen. And asked why? Education secretaries, successive education secretaries had been aware of the problem but done nothing about it. Jonathan Slater responded, the top political priority in respect of school building when I was the permanent secretary was in opening new free schools. So there it is. 10 minutes after 10. I'm not live on YouTube, by the way. We put the programme up later. I'm given you slightly the wrong end of the stick on that one. So here's our first entrant into Idiot's Corner of the day. This is David in Gloucestershire. James O'Brien, you are a Class 1 idiot. You really are. What a fool. This concrete has been going on for over 50 years, and it is not on Rishi Sunak. This has been Labour, Conservative, everybody. What an idiot you really are. So David's in Idiot's Corner because he is unaware of the fact that the man who was running the Department of Education, as this problem's urgency became clear, has explained this morning what happened when Rishi Sunak was asked for the money to fix the schools. He said no. Not only did he say no, he actually reduced the amount that had previously been available. Do you know what he did have the money for? I don't know if you remember this. I don't know. I mean, this wasn't our money. This wasn't taxpayers' money. This was some of the money that he made by betting against Britain during the financial crisis in 2008. But it meant that he could find about $3 million to give to his old college in America. Rishi Sunak and his wife gave $3 million to the Claremont McKenna computing lab in California, where him and his wife studied. I think she studied economics and French. Fees are about $86,500 a year. So he can find $3 million of his own money for a computer lab at an already lavishly funded college in California. But when charged with looking after British school children and protecting them from falling concrete, answer came there none. Right, that's the politics of it. I have failed in the course of that contemplation to come up with a question about the politics that sort of pops out of the bottom of this conversation. I hoped that a question would present itself to me. Was it Building Schools for the Future programme, I think Brett in Huddersfield has called it. So Labour had it in place, the Tories abolished it, and when asked by civil servants for the money to prevent the problems that we're currently suffering from, Rishi Sunak turned around and said no. And the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, has essentially gone missing, although I think she'll be required to say something in the House of Commons later today. There's another 1,500 schools or so that still haven't returned their surveys. That's about 10% of English schools. The Daily Mail today is trying to make the story all about Wales, where I'm sure there are also questions to be answered, but not the questions necessarily that the government will be prepared to address. So I've got two questions for you. One is about the state of our schools. We touched on this on Friday. I find it hard to believe, actually, that schools have been allowed to wither in this way. And that will lead us into our second question, which is the political will, or the absence of political will, to fix this stuff. If you are a teacher in particular, it's the busiest day of your year, I know, but not everybody's gone back yet, and you might be on a break. If you're a teacher, how do you rationalise the contempt in which you appear to be held by Conservative governments? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. How do you, looking at the state of your school, and it doesn't have to be just the concrete. Someone pointed out to me earlier that during the return to school in the midst of COVID, schools were being instructed to open windows, and teachers were reporting that they hadn't been able to open the windows for 8 years because they'd been painted over previously during some sort of cheapskate pound shop refurbishment. I don't know what it's like to be a teacher. I rely on you to tell me what it's like to be a teacher, but I can begin to imagine what it would be like to discover today that the Chancellor, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, now Prime Minister, personally took the decision to not fix the schools that are now being closed or disrupted because of the risk of this concrete. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. I don't think anyone can answer the question as to why has it all happened so belatedly. I'd need to have a government minister prepared to talk to me, which sadly hasn't been the case for the best part of a decade. But were that happy day to dawn, the simple question you'd want to ask is how has this happened so belatedly? Why at 8:10 on Sunday night is the Department of Education issuing instructions to schools when they literally open in a few hours? I don't get that. There's three things I don't get this morning. The first is, why have schools been allowed to unravel in this way? 0345 6060 973. And attendant on that, of course, the question of what's it like to be in a school where you can see the physical decline. Question number two, what explains the tardiness? Why are they sending out these messages at 8:10 on a Sunday night when the children are going back to school on Monday morning? I don't know who can answer this. We can just have a speculate if you want. But how can the logistics of that be permitted? 0345 6060 973. And then this question of Sunak, the question of Rishi Sunak, and the incredibly swift disappearance of his sheen. Do you remember his early sheen when, I think partly through relief even, that the absolute carnage of Boris Johnson's corruption was finally behind us, and then the catastrophic tenure of Liz Truss was swiftly brought to an end, and you thought, well, it can't get any worse. Say what you like about Rishi Sunak, it can't get any worse. And then he talked about professionalism, accountability and integrity, and you thought to yourself, gosh, that's a bit of a sly dig at Johnson, isn't it? Even though he was Chancellor and sat on his hands for most of Boris Johnson's premiership, he's clearly talking about his predecessors when he says we will have professionalism, accountability and integrity, because that is implicitly saying we haven't had it for a while. And then he gave Suella Braverman a job back 3 hours later, and all hopes of improvement or rehabilitation in that area disappeared immediately. But this is really bad, and I don't really get it. Someone comes to you and says, schools are collapsing, potentially. Schools are falling down, potentially. We need money to stop it from happening. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer says, no. I don't really have a question there. I'm just telling you the facts and inviting you to comment on them. Hit the numbers now. You will get through, okay? 0345 6060 973. How do we account for the crumbling of our schools? How have the Conservatives let it happen? Why has this particular problem been addressed so late in the day? And what do we think about Rishi Sunak's personal and very deliberate refusal to free the funds that were needed to fix the schools that are crumbling? 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 20 minutes after 10. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I sometimes wonder whether anyone else bothers doing this stuff. So, don't blame it on Michael Gove. Don't blame it, Labour would be well. I'm not getting many of those messages, to be fair. I think the rush to be in Idiot's Corner this morning has yet to gather pace. But Michael Gove admitted in 2016 that ditching building schools for the future was one of his worst mistakes. Speaking to the inimitable Andrew Marr, whose old show on the BBC has lost about a third of its viewers, I was reading this weekend, since Andrew, of course, joined LBC. Back tonight on your radios at 6. The the interview saw Michael Gove admitting that he'd muffed it up. It's amazing, isn't it, how forgiving this country can be if you're basically a right-wing Tory in hock to the Murdoch media and all the think tanks. You just get another, that's a shame. Yeah, I abolished the Building Schools for the Future programme, but never mind. I'll be back soon as Levelling Up Secretary or something like that. He said, I remember David Davis came up to me at the end of what had been a very bruising experience for me in the House of Commons. He said, well, and he used an Anglo-Saxon phrase, but you will be a better minister for this because you learn from your mistakes. So one of the main reasons why schools are crumbling is because of Gove's decision to abandon improvement plans for 719 of them. And according to the man that was running the Department of Education subsequently from 2016 to 2020, the obsession with opening free schools exacerbated this problem. Michael Gove admitted his regret in 2016, and it affected his progress, his career, his reputation, not one jot. Chris is in Tower Hamlets, always helpful on subjects like this, a former head teacher, so no doubt able to make perfect sense of everything that is unfolding before us, Chris.
If only, James. Good morning. No, I just wanted to point out to you, I'm sure you'll remember that jaw-dropping though this is,
yes,
to discover that Rishi Sunak as Chancellor did what he did and halving the number of schools to be rebuilt. Remember that this was the Chancellor of the Exchequer who, when the government's own czar, Sir Kevin Collins, who they appointed to tell them what they needed to do to save the children who'd suffered during the COVID pandemic, ultimately the disaster which we can see unfolding before us. I mean, he told them, this is what you need to do, and it'll cost you £15 billion. Rishi Sunak said, well, here's £1.4 billion.
Yes.
And Kevin Collins immediately resigned, correctly, in my opinion.
Yes, do you know, I'd forgotten that. And in fact, some of the details still elude me, but you can be fairly confident that if the boot had been on the other foot and it had been a Labour politician acting with such callous disregard for British school children, it would no doubt have received rather more coverage.
Oh, you can bet.
It's crazy. So what do you think's happened here then? I mean, let's start with you in your head teacher days, getting a message at 8:10 on a Sunday night when you're opening up the school tomorrow morning, telling you you've got to fill in this form about concrete, which has been known about for years.
Yeah, I know. I was saying to your producer,
Yep.
I miss my school like mad, but I just woke up the other morning thinking, just this once, thank goodness I'm not any longer in charge of that school and being told that. I mean, it would just be the most appalling news, because I know from bitter experience how long these things take. I mean, I heard ministers glibly talking about putting in porta cabin classrooms. And they have no idea how long it takes to actually put in the hard standing upon which the porta cabins...
It's not like pitching a tent. And, of course, you need money to do that as well. And the money comes out of the same budget that you're hoping to be getting teaching assistants or SEN teachers in.
Exactly. I mean, that's one to keep a close eye on, James. They keep on issuing new guidance about what will and won't be paid for. I mean, it's fine to say, oh, you can use that empty school classroom down the road, but by the way, we're not going to pay for the transport to get the children to and from it every day. Well, where's that money going to come from then?
I don't know. Quick word on the politics, if you would, because you mentioned the engagement with their own school czar ending so dismally. Yeah. But is it, and if we were looking for a pithy way of understanding this from the outside, is it a sort of widget scenario where Rishi Sunak fails to see these people as children? He sees them instead as economic units, or he sees them as something other than flesh and blood, and therefore when asked to spend money on protecting them, or as Labour will no doubt make political hay out of later today, saving their lives potentially, he just sees pound signs and decimal points.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any special insights into Rishi Sunak's mind, but I, as you know, can't help feeling that people who have less reliance on public services tend to be a little bit more cavalier when it comes to making the all-important decisions about spending on them. I mean, where are Rishi Sunak's children going to school? Where are most of the Conservative... I don't know,
but one day, hopefully, they'll be able to pull up a chair at the Murty Sunak Quantitative and Computing Lab at the US College Claremont McKenna, which has a $1.1 billion fortune thanks to benefactors, including $3 million from our current Prime Minister himself. He also found 100 grand to give to his old public school, of course, Winchester College. 10:26 is the time. Come at this, thank you, Chris, come at this from whatever angle you like. I'm going to struggle, I imagine, to get teachers who are in job today because it's the first day back at school and a busier day than usual. But if you can spare a moment or two to tell us either what it's like when the school in which you work is unravelling, or what you make of the politics of this story, particularly. And Chris has just reminded me that I've slightly misrepresented the story. It's even worse than I allowed because I you know what I'm like. I'm a bit slapdash some mornings, particularly Mondays. And I read about the civil service asking for 300 or 400 schools worth of cash to be fixed. And Sunak gave them 100. And then he actually said, no, you can have 50. So he halved the original agreement. So I say to you, 300 or 400 schools a year, otherwise we're going to have precisely the crisis that we've got now. Yeah? And you say you can have 100. And I go, oh, crikey, that's ridiculous. And you say, right, 50 then. I mean, it's actually pathetic, as far as I can tell. But I wonder whether he will lose a single vote on Fifth Avenue. Alan's in Manchester. Alan, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, Alan.
Do you think that donation from Sunak had anything to California had anything to do with his application for a green card to become an American citizen?
I don't know what the chronology of it was. I think he already had the green card before he gave the money over. It was the slowness in surrendering the green card that was suspicious, wasn't it? Almost as if he had one eye on the exit until this wonderful new opportunity to be Prime Minister presented itself.
Yeah. What I failed to tell your producer is I'm actually a governor at a local school.
Okay.
And this has parallels with 1995, 1996, where the school, when I'm still a governor, didn't even have a BBC Acorn.
Gosh.
And the library was full of old books, and the roof did leak. And all of a sudden, these two chaps called Blair and Brown appeared.
Yes.
I remember the head teacher, I was picking up my kids at that time, and the head teacher came and said, we've got the extension. I said, what? He said, no, we've got an extension. So basically, over the term of Gordon and Tony, we got two extensions. We got the old gas boiler cleared out. We got a new one coming, which immediately cut the fuel bills by half. Yeah. We got a new fence put around the school. We got a new playground concreted over. More importantly, we had a new computer suite. Every child had a computer. Every class board had a whiteboard. We had high-speed broadband. The money that the children attract, it used to be called age-weighted pupil-assisted formula. That means whenever the child goes in school, it carries a piece of money, and that goes to the school's budget. That trebled. We had teaching assistants, and we had class sizes under 30. And now we've gone backwards because I think it was Ed Balls's Building School for the Future programme that the Tories sacked.
Yes, in fact, Ed Balls, to give him credit, on the day it was announced that it was being scrapped, said it was a very dark day for British schools.
Yeah, well, it was if you believe in state education. But Sunak and co, like you say, he went to Winchester College.
Well, I went to public school. It doesn't disqualify you from understanding the importance of state education.
Yeah, I know, James. But when this government, a local authority cannot build a school. It's got to be a free school. It's got to be an academy.
Yeah, there it is.
A lot of these schools, if they're academies or free schools, if they get that letter. I mean, in the good old days, if a local authority got that letter, you got on the building services, the council said, can you go through the records? Have we got this, is it done? And the other thing I wanted to say is, the school where I'm a governor, we actually got new classrooms about 18 months ago.
Right.
And and we've been badgering to get these replaced. The original classrooms were built in 1948.
Good Lord.
Yeah, and that that's probably repeated all over the country. So when you're talking about the politics of it, did Gordon and Tony make a difference? Yes. And my kids were lucky; they're all adults now to be in that period where the money went into education, secondary schools, primary schools.
The receipts are there. You're not expressing an opinion; you're just counting. The receipts are there, and I mean, I'm not on first name terms with them like you are, Alan. But when Blair and Brown. When Brown in particular was completely misrepresented by David Cameron and Gove and the rest of them as having somehow caused the financial crisis of 2008, the global financial crisis of 2008. It gave them the camouflage they needed to embark upon this essentially ideological programme of cuts to public services. Do you think it salves their conscience, the academy free school angle? Do you think it lets them think, no, we haven't deprived, we haven't damaged the education of British children? Look, there's some over there at an academy.
I don't think they've got a conscience. And, the thing is, they're inept. They're incompetent. We have to realise this, James. They are totally inept and incompetent.
That is the mother of all elephants in the room after 13 years of client media and completely appalling government, is that they are just rubbish. Some mornings we probably try too hard looking for theories and explanations, but Alan's analysis there, well, straight to the top of the class. It's an A star or a 9 or whatever they're calling them these days, and there it is. They're just really bad at all this stuff. Gove in particular, supposed to be the clever one. 6 years after abolishing the scheme that would have prevented this crisis from happening, who says, oh, sorry, I made a boo-boo. That's it. He's rare in that he actually admits he's made a mistake. The rest of them wouldn't even do that. It's 10:32. Holly Harris has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:35 is the time. It's funny, isn't it? Poverty scepticism or poverty denial will be getting a big shakedown, a big run out in the run up to the next election. There's a story today about teachers reporting children coming to school dirty because the cost of washing clothes, or indeed washing children, if you want to heat the boiler, is becoming prohibitive for more and more families. It's weird. When we talked about warm banks and pensioners who had to go and essentially sit in the local library or especially opened community centre for a few hours every day because keeping the house warm was beyond them, the poverty sceptics didn't really kick in. The poverty deniers didn't really start sharpening their cudgels. But as soon as you start talking about British children, these right-wing ghouls are absolutely jumping up and down at the opportunity to accuse the parents of somehow lying. It's so bizarre, isn't it, that the people who insist that we have to look after our own in the context of, for example, refugees, can't wait to start attacking our own when they become victim to the cost of living crisis. And the reason it's particularly tin-eared politically at the moment is that I think most people are going to completely recognise the reality of not being able to afford to do things that you could previously do. So for people who are lucky to be quite well off, you might be downgrading from branded toothpaste to own brand toothpaste or something like that. But of course, the people 2 rungs lower than you on the ladder will be thinking about not buying toothpaste at all. The cost of running a washing machine is bound to be prohibitive in a country where people can't afford to turn the heating on. And yet all of this stuff, despite being obvious and logical and, of course, reported by school staff, so 72% of school staff surveyed think there has been an increase in what they're calling hygiene poverty in the last year. How could there not be, given the relationship between hygiene and energy costs? And yet, give it 10 minutes, there'll be a column in the Daily Mail claiming to know better than 3/4 of teachers. And I wonder what the crossover is between poverty denial and climate change denial. And then to throw in another circle for this Venn diagram, the look after our own brigade, who, when offered an opportunity to look after our own, disappear faster than you can say lying, hypocritical grifters. I just thought I'd get that off my chest because we're talking about schools collapsing and Rishi Sunak not being able to afford to fix them, apparently. There's no poverty denial. Of course he can't afford to fix them. It's bizarre, isn't it? And, of course, when asked to provide funding for 300 to 400 schools, he turned around and said, no, you can have funding for 100. And then shortly after that decided that was far too generous and you can have funding for 50. And now we look at the scenario in which we find ourselves and wonder what the hell is going on. I don't get the politics. I like this, though. Rishi Sunak just went full dad, James. Dad, can I have £2, please? £1? What do you want 50p for? I like it. Lisa's in Faversham. Lisa, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, Lisa.
I'm probably as close as you're going to get to a teacher today because they're all going to be really busy getting their classrooms
yes,
ready for the new year.
I do realise, but you know me, I like to set myself challenges, Lisa. I like to. What are you doing teaching children when you could be phoning LBC would be my response to those teachers. But you crack on. You've recently knocked it on the head.
Yeah, I left about 6 months ago and I taught for 23 years in Kent. And some of the things that I've seen, particularly in the last 13 years, 2010, 13 years, have just absolutely shocked me.
Go on.
I started teaching in 2001. Those first 10 years were just marvellous, really. Teachers got training, buildings were in good condition, schools were being built and so on. And in fact, the Building Schools for the Future programme was working its way through Kent, with many schools being rebuilt, really good quality buildings as well, really well finished. The chap who was on earlier was talking about computer suites and so on. These things were really, amazing, these buildings. Now, the area where I live, we were drawing up plans. The architects were in. They were coming up with wonderful ideas to make our schools in the local area, something to be proud of. And then the funding was cancelled. It was 2010. And I'm not going to name schools, but okay. I just wanted to draw your attention to one. This school really did need rebuilding and still does. But in order to kind of counter some of the major problems like windows that either didn't shut or open, one of the two, there was never the in-between bit, drafty buildings, it was one or the other. They had to look for other methods, and irony of ironies, the windows and doors and so on got replaced, thankfully, so they did actually shut. But one way that they got around the leaking and drafty concrete was to put cladding on top of them. So you've now got is schools that on the outside look quite nice. They still have all of the problems, probably. I don't know. I'm not a building inspector, but they're very likely to still have those problems. They're very much that era, and now they're covered with cladding. And I just think that all of this has led to short-sighted solutions that are just.
But what's the rationale behind? Jonathan Portes, who's a brilliant contributor to public discourse on all sorts of areas, is a professor of economics at King's College, but he's valuable on all sorts of areas. He just points out that Jonathan Slater, the civil servant who's sort of blown the whistle this morning, proves it's not incompetence by ministers or civil servants. It's not a sort of unforeseeable act of God. It's a very deliberate political decision about tax and spending priorities by the then Chancellor and indeed the current government. He failed to fund a critical schools rebuilding scheme when he was Chancellor. So what when you're at the coalface or the chalk face, how do you rationalise that when you're giving it your all and often going beyond the call of duty to look after children? You sort of look at the government's apparent lack of concern, even borderline contempt.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure, but so many teachers and school staff in general just so used to being ready to go the extra mile that you plug on regardless. I always say that schools are held together by purely the goodwill of staff
and rubber bands.
Absolutely, if you can afford them in your budget, absolutely. It's that, I think, and any chance that we've ever had to raise our heads above the parapet and say no, enough. And the right-wing media has shot us straight back down. Of course,
and if you dare to go on strike, then you can expect to be public enemy number one by the end of the week. Lisa, thank you. You reminded me of a couple of other things, actually, as you speak, that notion of putting your head above the parapet. 10:43 is the time, and the notion also of, I think there is a danger of overthinking it. You sort of sit here and think, but how can they do this? It affects their children. And largely it doesn't. I mean, the poorer the school, the poorer the area, the less likely it is to have the child of a Conservative politician in it or a big mouth radio broadcaster. Let's never pretend that I'm not aware of my own privilege. But the idea that you use your privilege to make life worse for people who lack it is so callous that I think we sometimes are reluctant to go there, which leaves you an opportunity to give me a better explanation for why Rishi Sunak, when asked to fund 300 to 400 schools a year, reduced the funding from 100 to 50. Kathy's in Bermondsey. Kathy, what would you like to say?
Hi,
Hello.
I'm a ex-teacher. I retired 2 years ago, having 35 years under my belt, so I've been around a bit. So many buildings have always been collapsing.
Yes.
I mean, I had young children. If it rained, they jumped up and moved all the display because they knew that's where the rain came in. So, that they knew, the children knew it, that we all knew it.
Yes.
I was there on Schools for the Future. Unfortunately, budget was cut. But I know
it was scrapped altogether, wasn't it, in 2010?
Well, it went. I was there for consultations, but then it went. But one of the things, and this may be cynical.
Go on, be cynical first, and then I'll ask you the question.
I just think, we had COVID.
Yeah.
So suddenly it was it was emergency. So they gave their friends all these contracts.
Yes, they did.
They didn't come back with any of the goods, but they gave them the contracts, and they all earned a lot of money.
Yes, they did.
Now this is now an emergency. Oh my word! Have we got some friends who might have picked up a brick once?
Send them in to do it all. We'll only fund the rebuilding program when Michelle Mone has set up a building company, and then we'll be laughing. You are being a bit cynical, but I'm not here to deny the basis for your cynicism. What I don't get is that little dot joining exercise towards the end there, Kathy, when everyone knows that if you don't spend this money, bad things are going to happen. So when he signs off at the end of the day, upon which he said, no, you can't have enough funding for 300 to 400 schools. In fact, since you asked, I'm going to reduce the funding for 100 schools a year down to 50. When he signs off at the end of that day, is he just crossing his fingers and thinking, oh, it's never going to happen? Or is he thinking something more sinister than that? Or is he not thinking at all?
Well, I think let's get rid of some of the roughs, that might kill off a few. And I know that...
I thought you'd been cynical before.
That don't wash, the kids who come in and they don't wash.
Yeah.
So,
let's hope the concrete falls on their heads. That might be the logic of the poverty deniers this morning.
Yeah, it's awful, but I just don't know how he sleeps at night.
No, I don't either. Well, I mean, possibly he consoles himself with the knowledge that he gave £100,000 to his old public school and $3 million to him and his wife's college in California. So who can possibly accuse him of not funding education, Kathy, eh? Answer me that. I think you'll find I'm a very generous funder of educational institutions. Just ask Winchester College or, checks notes, Claremont McKenna in California.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:50 is the time. We need something to replace Dory's Watch, don't we? I've got a couple of ideas. I'm quite keen on unhinged headline unhinged headline. Have we got an unhinged headline? Yeah, I kicked off about not getting a jingle for Dory's Watch. So just you wait. I'm going to ask for an unhinged headline jingle and see how long it takes to get one. All right. Just so can you make sure I've got an unhinged headline jingle, please, by close of play today? Or else I've got the biggest audience on this station. I'm sick to death of coming second, third, and fourth to all the others. All right, so I want an unhinged. That's me. That is man management. That is laying down the law. We'll see how that works out, shall we? Although I'm also drawn to the Brexiters complaining about the state of the country without any scintilla of self-awareness. It's becoming an actual genre of journalism. I can't remember, who was it last week who was complaining that? It was Sarah Vine, Michael Gove's ex-wife, complaining that everything's broken in this country. And now Carol Malone, who is still plying her trade at the Express, is writing nothing works in Britain anymore. Not the trains, the planes, the NHS, the civil service, nothing. Even worse, there are no consequences and no one cares. I'll tell you who cares. Everybody who warned about what would happen if you left these vampires in charge. And yet here we are. But I don't think I've got a feature yet. What's that you say? Oh, okay. Let's have a listen.
Unhinged headline.
That's more like it. You see, that's what happens when you throw your weight around a bit around the office. You get what you want. I'm supposed to have a giant mug as well. I'm supposed to have a giant mug because we're now recording the programme every day and it will be going out as a YouTube special after. How long will it take to turn around, do we think? So they've basically confiscated my giant mug. You're familiar with my giant mug? It's enormous. And they told me they'd commissioned a replacement mug that was as big as the giant mug they have confiscated, because it's all about branding, you see, when you're on YouTube, apparently. And they have now delivered me my new giant mug. It's approximately 1 centimetre larger than an average mug. It is nowhere near the size. Nowhere near. You could get about 6 of these in my normal mug. So unless my new weight throwing techniques are in decline, I think I'm going to have an even bigger mug soon. I digress slightly. 10:52 is the time. We're talking about schools, concrete, Rishi Sunak, the abject failure to fund the refurbishments that were needed, and the political decision to do it. If you were Keir Starmer, would you postpone your reshuffle today? This is a big, big, big scandal, and it's all on Sunak. It's all on Sunak. He didn't build the concrete, but he rejected the pleas from civil servants. And I'm going to play you a bit of the interview where all of this came to light earlier this morning. He rejected the pleas to fix the problem that is now happening on his watch. So if you were Keir Starmer, what would you do today? Fill your boots on this? Or carry on with your scheduled reshuffle? I genuinely don't know. I suspect he'll do the latter. 10:53 is the time. Caris is in East Ham. Caris, sorry about that. I went off on a bit of a mad tangent. I do apologise.
That's fine. Sorry to hear about your mug.
Well, thank you. Finally some sympathy. I'm not getting any here. What made you pick up the phone, if you can remember?
I can't remember. I'm a teacher at the moment, and I'm part-time, so I'm not teaching today.
Okay, cool.
And I thought you might want to hear from
Yes,
a teacher
please.
who's in a school who's affected by RAC.
Yes, please.
So we found out I teach in kind of East London, on the border of East London and Essex, and we found out about the RAC in kind of February, March, just after the teacher strikes. And it just sends the school into chaos logistically, and I just thought logistically it might be interesting for people to know what happened. So children, hundreds and hundreds of children are displaced. So if about 50% of our school was closed for about 2 weeks, so those children had to be taught online again. And then once they come back, those certain rooms are forbidden. So the DfE came in and did an inspection and said, no, absolutely no one's allowed in that room.
This was in March?
This was in February, March, soon around the time of the strikes. So, I mean, for teachers, it's just been like you just get over COVID and you're teaching back in classrooms. And then there's the strikes, of course, and then there was the RAC. So I felt like the spring term, we were hardly teaching a week without having to teach from home or teach certain classes. But we've got 2,000 children in our school,
cool.
and I've just got the message today that 3-year groups won't be coming in, so we'll be teaching online again. So I'm feeling terrible for those children.
So 3 whole year groups are going back to remote learning for the foreseeable, or is there a date at the end of the tunnel?
For 2 weeks, as far as I know. But and in terms of you were asking about teachers and the state of the schools, if I'm honest, I don't have time to think about that. As long as I've got a space to teach in. But when I think about it, obviously you can't, the windows didn't open during COVID. No, that's absolutely right.
And they didn't put in HEPA machines either.
Yeah. But and when you think about it, some of the school, but teachers themselves aren't that concerned as long as we've got a space to teaching and the technology and the children are there and there's no COVID going around and you can get into the room. But I mean, it's dreadful, isn't it, when you think about it? Like this kind of thing does make you think of the teacher, the actual environment that you're teaching in matters.
Well, there's a couple of things I don't understand. Is why the story has blown up now, given that. And quite a few of my texters were telling me that this has been known about for ages. And
I don't understand either. I don't get it, because obviously our school, this was back in February, March, that the DfE came in and said, actually, no. And we had a 24 hours notice. So we had an emergency staff meeting, this year group, not coming in. And of course, our timetabler and the senior leadership team who have worked so hard to try and to get the children back into school after, the strikes and after COVID. They're just at their wits' end, trying to re-room this class, that class. Music can't teach in music because RE has to come and teach there. Maths has to go and teach in this block. This year group can't come in because it's just a logistical nightmare. And it's,
on top of all the other problems as well. It is surreal, isn't it? And I mean, just to add irony to insult, if Gove hadn't abolished the scheme in 2010, then guess which year would have been the year at which it completed, Caris?
I don't know, this year?
Yeah, 2023, mate.
Yeah,
you couldn't make it up. So you've left only one gap in my knowledge, which is why has this happened now, given that the problems were known and documented and identified, and I mean, 10 past 8 on a Sunday night. That's breathtaking incompetence, really.
It is. Yeah, and why teachers are being like, I got a text last night saying what the update was, and that's the day before the school begins. And not only they have the 6 weeks, but our school, the DFE knew about our school, so I assume they knew about.
They must have known about
others,
others, or even if they didn't. I mean, how many schools is a story? One school, 50 schools, 40 schools? I don't know. Caris, thank you, and good luck this term. I know your job is much harder than it should be. I'm just going to play you a few words from that interview that we've referenced all morning. Jonathan Slater, previously Permanent Secretary at the DFE, the Department for Education, so effectively the head honcho, goes to the Treasury, where Rishi Sunak is Chancellor, having previously, of course, been Chief Secretary, says they need the money to rebuild parts of 300 to 400 schools. Treasury says you can have funding to rebuild 100. This is Jonathan Slater describing his own reaction when he was told the news.
So it's frustrating, of course, when for you the most important thing is the priority to be given to safety. If the Treasury, of course, have got a concern that there's never enough money for everything, but we were able to present them with really good data. We weren't just saying there's a significant risk of fatality. We were saying there's a critical risk to life if this programme is not funded. While I was the Permanent Secretary in 2018, a concrete block fell from the roof of a primary school. So it wasn't just a risk, it was actually starting to happen. The spending review was completed a year after I left the department, and I was absolutely amazed to see that the decision made by the government was to halve the school rebuilding programme, down from 100 a year to 50 a year.
Go on. Riddle me that. And that interview conducted on the BBC this morning, I can tell you that Branwen Jeffries, the BBC's rather excellent education editor, has tweeted, it's hard to overstate how extraordinary it is for a former senior civil servant to speak out like this. In part, Jonathan Slater is speaking out to make utterly clear their advice over RAC was ignored and Sunak cut back spending further. It's also hard not to hear the sound of chickens coming home to roost. Slater is just one of the respected permanent secretaries forced out by this government, breaking the tradition that ministers took responsibility for their decisions. What did I tell you on Friday? They are opposed to the truth. It's that serious and it's that bad. And that's why you've seen the civil service depicted as a blob or as enemies of progress, because they tell the truth. It's why Truss and Kwarteng ignored the Office of Budgetary Responsibility, and it's why people like Cummings got senior civil servants like him ditched from the Department for Education. Anyone standing up and saying, stop, that's not true, is an enemy now. It's 11 o'clock.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 4 minutes after 11 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I suppose we should spend a moment to reflect upon the story in Holly's bulletin there about Gavin Williamson being forced to apologise for bullying the Chief Whip. So if you're assembling a sort of a pack or a list of the attributes that have led us into this mess, even now as right-wing journalists are queuing up to write articles about the terrible state that the country is in and why are things so bad, you vote to become the first country in history to impose economic sanctions on itself, and the consequences should not have been particularly hard to identify. But entitlement's a huge part of it as well. You know, whether you're Kwasi Kwarteng thinking you know better than the entire Office of Budgetary Responsibility, so you'll just crack on with your ludicrous Tufton Street flavoured budget anyway, or whether you're Gavin Williamson thinking that you've got a right to be at the late Queen's funeral and will bully the Chief Whip of your own party. Looking at Williamson, I'm going to say something a little, what would the word be? A little ripe. But looking at him, I don't think he'd have bullied a man. Just entirely based upon impressions given. I don't think he'd have bullied a man. He was a former Chief Whip himself, of course. Supposedly had a black book of indiscretions. He was once photographed when it looked like he might get reshuffled. He was once photographed. Was it with a whip as well? What a weird country we've become. Or rather, what a weird bunch of politicians have been running this country for the last few years. Gavin Williamson, who responded, of course, to the attack upon the Skripal family in Salisbury that left the local woman Dawn Sturgis dead. He responded by saying that the Russians should go away and shut up. And that gets you promoted. in the modern Tory party. But anyway, Gavin Williamson in trouble again, and none of it matters. He's still got a knighthood. Precisely the kind of people being rewarded in the current political climate are precisely the kind of people that will bully their own colleagues because they think that they should somehow have a God-given right to attend the late Queen's funeral. What a horrible punctuation mark that is on that whole sad saga. 6 minutes after 11 is the time. I'm going to do something completely different now. It's a very education-heavy news agenda today. I don't know whether you've noticed this. There are the stories of the teachers who are routinely encountering children whose clothes haven't been washed because of the cost, of course, of undertaking laundry at home. And there are, as we've covered, stories about the schools that are falling apart and the absolute failure or the deliberate choice by Rishi Sunak to deny them the funds that were needed, following the deliberate choice by Michael Gove to abandon the scheme that would have had them all fixed and fit for purpose by, wait for it, this year. I mean, crikey. And I still haven't got an answer to the question of why it's all blown up so late in the day. But I have a feeling we'll probably be returning to some of this territory subsequently. So I want to do something completely different. And it's very gentle, this. I can't imagine there's going to be any fisticuffs. We probably won't even need to put anyone in Idiot's Corner. There'll be no political toing and froing. It's a very simple story about a very sad phenomenon reported in a number of newspapers today. Children's enjoyment of reading has fallen to a 20-year low, according to a national survey. This is the National Literacy Trust looking at the enthusiasm with which children approach reading and calling for urgent action as it published new data showing that the number of children reading for pleasure is at an all-time low. That makes me so sad, for reasons that probably don't need explaining, but which I'll explain anyway. Because I'm just thinking about the kids going to school in dirty clothes and the one opportunity they have to escape the humdrum or even the bleak nature of their current existence would be through escapism. And I know that you can find a form of escapism through technology. I'm not for a minute here to set up technology in opposition to reading books. But obviously, if money is a big problem in the household, where escapism is at a premium, then a book is going to be a much cheaper and easier way of providing it, especially a book from the library, than a iPad or a tablet or a smartphone. And the numbers are pretty stark. They're down a bit from 2021, but down a lot from longer ago. 2016, the percentage of children who were enjoying reading was at 58.6%, and today it's down to 47.8%. We don't know why. I don't think you get technology as an answer because the technology's not that new, is it now? I mean, you can't sit there going, oh, wow, when I was a kid, you didn't have Grand Theft Auto or you didn't have Angry Birds. The technology's been a clear and present option for children since at least 2016 when enjoying reading was at an all-time high. So 9 minutes after 11 is the time. Again, I'll offer you a selection of questions to answer, I think. The first is actually why? Why has enjoyment... Did you find your attention span was damaged by lockdown? I thought during lockdown, if I hadn't made the mistake of trying to write a book, I thought during lockdown that I would read loads. Because I lose 2 hours on the commute every day when we were working from home in particular, when I was doing the show from the shed. I thought I would read loads. I was going to read all the books I'd never got around to reading. You know, like the Russians. I was going to read all the Russians. All the Russians. I couldn't read a thing. I could barely read a comic. Something quite weird happened to me during lockdown with books, and I've read all my life. I think I went for the longest period without reading a book from beginning to end during the pandemic than I have at any other point in my life. So here is the question for your starter at 10, which is why has the enjoyment of reading diminished? So it's not even necessarily why has reading diminished. It's specifically why has the enjoyment of reading diminished? Okay, that's a slightly nuanced question, isn't it? That's one that no one can provide a definitive answer to, but you can provide a personal answer, perhaps. You can provide an answer from your own perspective. The second question, rather obviously, then, becomes, how do we fix this? And everyone can join in on this. How do you, from your perspective as a parent or a teacher or a grandparent, How do you instill a love of reading in a child who hasn't currently got one? We did a wonderful, wonderful phone-in once about adults discovering reading quite late in life. It was one of my all-time favourites. I don't know where it came from, and you know the story I always remind you of when I mention this. It was a squaddy coming back from exercise, noticing that the sergeant major was in the exercise yard looking for a volunteer, as they call them in the army. And the response to this, to avoid being volunteered for duties, was to duck into a building he'd never been in before. And it was the library. And he picked up a book, started reading it, and at that moment became an enthusiastic reader. It stayed with him for the rest of his life, or it stayed with him certainly up until the point he called me to tell me about it. That can happen in childhood. That can happen at 10, 11, 12. What are the solutions? What are the answers to children no longer enjoying reading? And remember, we're comparing it with 2016, when the percentage was at the highest ever recorded. So some of the obvious answers don't apply. It's not technology. It's not, for example, library closures as a consequence of austerity. I always think of that wonderful Alexei Sayle line at this point, that the austerity policies of David Cameron and George Osborne was a response to the knowledge, or the fact, that the global financial crisis of 2008 was caused by there being too many libraries in Wolverhampton. So Cameron and Osborne started closing libraries at a rate of knots, which is probably a contributing factor, but they started doing it in 2010. So if enjoying reading was at the highest it's ever been in 2016, that might be part of an answer, but it's not going to be all of the answer. Julie reminds us that Sure Start used to role model sitting with toddlers to look at books. Sure Start would teach parents who perhaps hadn't had books in their own lives themselves to bring books into the lives of their children. Sure Start, very much a casualty of austerity cuts. But that means that we're focusing on children who would not have got the help they needed at home. And that is healthy and necessary, perhaps, but it's not going to be all of the story. Phil in Cardiff points out the cost of books is prohibitive at the moment and stopping me from buying books. It's a valid point, and library closures are pertinent, but there are still libraries around. And also charity shops are great for books. If you like crime fiction like I do, you can sometimes find the entire works of a popular crime fiction author. You don't have to buy all of them, of course, but I presume that's house clearances, isn't it? Or people just sort of tidying up a bit, and they love an author, so they've bought every book that author's ever written. You pop in to Save the Children, you get Lee Child from beginning to end, every single thing every word he's ever penned. But the question is this. The question is, how do you do it? How do you fix it? Can you do it? It's boring. I've got a bookworm and I've got a non-bookworm, but they both enjoy reading up to a point, but not to the point where it's, for one of them, where it is the major pastime. How do you instead? It had very little to do with us, I think. It had very little to do with us. So question number one, why do you think the number of children who enjoy reading has hit an all-time low in the last few years? And I'll take anything you want. Don't worry about stating the obvious. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And then the second question is, what can we do about it? What can we do about it? And we'll move between the two, because for everyone, if you say, oh, well, here is a reason, then we can start thinking about what the solution might be. So TikTok, Alex in Mansfield suggests, has completely destroyed everyone's attention spans, not just children. You've got short 7-second videos to scratch the itch. It's so passive and easy. Right, I think he's onto something there. How do you persuade a child of the TikTok generation that there are riches, untold riches, to be enjoyed in reading books? 0345 6060 973. And a special message now for, I don't know what happened to my teeth then. It sounded like I was drunk. Or doing a very bad Sean Connery impression. A special message now for Kenny in Liverpool, who says, "Hi James, can you tell me, is your new book available on Audible?" The answer is, I start recording it this afternoon, Kenny. So hopefully there'll be lots of calls coming in the next hour, and I can rest my voice a bit. 0345 6060 973. Why aren't children enjoying reading like they used to do? And what can the rest of us do about it?
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 18 minutes after 11, and it's a sad story. But is it an inevitable one, or can we turn the oil tank around? Let's start with Elaine, who's in Doncaster. Elaine, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello.
First-time caller, very nervous.
It's only me. My first home was in
I know.
Doncaster, you know.
Sorry, what?
My first home was in Doncaster. We're practically related, Elaine.
Well, that's okay then, that's fine. Okay, so I have been sort of working in education for over 40 years now.
Gosh.
I retired about 8 years ago.
Yeah.
And after I retired, I went into an element of teacher training. So I was a tutor for new students. Yeah. So the difference over the years that I have found, and it's been a real bugbear for me, is that when I first started teaching, the highlight of the day was reading a children's novel to my class every day.
Yes.
So at the end of the day, we'd pack everything up. We'd all sit down in a little circle or, in front of the teacher. We get the book, we discuss the book, and then I start reading it. And you always left it at a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
And the children always were so excited for the next bit. The following day, they'd be begging you to read bits of it all through the day. And this went on for, quite a long time. And then we got the national curriculum.
Right.
And we subsequently got literacy hour and numeracy hour, in which you were meant to teach, all aspects of literacy in that 1 hour. And that was all you had in the day. And gradually, this having the time to sit on the carpet with the children and read a novel together and be excited and laugh and cry. Often cry. I've cried with classes of Year 6 pupils at Charlotte's Web.
Oh.
And they would bring their own books in and say, please, can you read this? And gradually over the years... It's
been worn away. It's been eroded away by literacy hour, which I think was about 25 years ago that came in, wasn't it?
Absolutely it was. But you see, what happens now is the only experience that a lot of children have been having of literature is looking at an extract from a book in which they then have to underline all the nouns or underline all the adjectives or look for clauses or look for the punctuation. And they never actually get a chance to enjoy the novel that they're doing that from.
How did you turn it round?
I think you turn it round by it has to be on an individual school basis.
Yeah.
And I think head teachers have been browbeaten, because they're Ofsted inspected and so on, into making sure that, all the curriculum as it stands is being taught as it stands. But they have to be brave enough to actually say, look, every day, end of the day, we go back to this.
We go and do a story, but there's no.
We go and do a story.
It's about the inner life, isn't it, as much as the outer life? It's not measurable.
Absolutely.
You can't transfer it into points or stars on a chart. It is just about feeding the soul, really, and that seems to be.
It is, and for a lot of children, James, in Doncaster, in the schools I worked in, they would not get that at home, and that's casting no aspersions on anyone, but they simply would not. And it's down to individual schools to have the courage to take this back and not to just be teaching to the tests or teaching to Ofsted.
Do you want to know something funny?
Go on then.
I just got a message. I got a text off Tina in Doncaster. And she said,
Did you?
She said, Elaine taught my kids. She's the best teacher ever.
Oh, my God, I know Tina, yeah. Oh, my God, yeah.
Isn't that lovely?
I know her. Yeah, she's wonderful.
So
she was a parent at my school.
Well, I worked that out when she said that you taught her kids.
We helped her go, and she went on and got degrees and so on, and she works in, she's worked in various important roles, and I think she works with asylum seekers now. Oh. But she's wonderful, and her kids were great.
Well, look at that. So you just explained why you loved your job so much. That's one of the reasons why I love my job so much. And what you remind us of is that little moment. Because I was quite a disruptive child, but I loved the reading stories.
No, never.
Well, no, I know. It's very hard to believe. I was occasionally. But that bit there was because you didn't, you could just sit back and absorb rather than having to do stuff, rather than having to graft.
And there's no better feeling as a teacher than having those 32 children sitting in front of you and having them in the palm of your hand. But you see, the new students, new trainee teachers now, they don't get that either, because when I was working with them, I'd say, well, what about doing, this that we've just been talking about? But I don't have time because we've got everything to fit in. And schools have to be brave.
So this is about sources, isn't it? I think you're absolutely right, Elaine, that is going to be one of the many reasons, but possibly the biggest reason why we're seeing this decline in the enjoyment of reading. It's not a decline in literacy necessarily, although that might go alongside it, but that taking away that joy, and one of the greatest ways to foster that joy, or even to begin that joy, to inspire that joy, is by being read to. Elaine, how did that work out, considering how nervous you were at the beginning?
Well, I'm okay now.
There you go, you see. So we'll do it again.
Yeah.
We'll do it again one day.
Cool.
I look forward to it. Thank you, Elaine. Take care. 24 minutes after 11. Chasey's in Blackheath. Chasey, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Not first time and not nervous.
I'll get you. Carry on.
I'm a retired teacher and head teacher, and I would absolutely agree with everything your previous caller, I think, is it Elaine, what she has said. And time is a real problem. But the other thing my point was really about as teachers come through the system, and they've come through the educational system and then the training teacher system, they're not coming through with a love of reading. And I'm not saying that they're not doing their darndest to do a good job, but they don't know necessarily what to read. And let's face it, there are some terrible books out there. I mean, there are books that are boring, that are just badly written, that don't engage children. And as a head, I would go through and look at my classes, and I would walk in, and a teacher would be doing the right thing, reading aloud, story time at the end of the day, but it wasn't engaging the children at all. And that will put children off.
Yes, of course it will.
So I think we need to have a whole big discussion, sort of nationally around the curriculum as to what's the core. What are the core texts? And I would totally support you can teach a child to read extracts, and they will do well on the reading tests. And that
I never knew that. That's been
easy.
Yeah,
it's so easy to do a good job just by teaching extracts. But we're at the figures are going in the opposite direction. So reading proficiency is going up in this country. Reading pleasure is going down. So we've got it all wrong, haven't we?
Well, not necessarily. We'd like both to be going up rather than it to be fully reversed and having literacy going down while enjoyment goes up. So
we're not teaching.
We've got it half right, and the half we've got wrong, we've clearly got very, very wrong.
Yeah. And actually, if you're not teaching proficiency through love of reading and really good texts, then it's going to drop off in later years.
I do wonder. I don't know if you saw Rishi Sunak getting excited about chess last week or the week before. I'm a big fan of chess, but he's making money available for chess. This would be such a simple and wonderful thing for a government to do, wouldn't it? And some schools are doing it. Plenty of primary schools will still be having reading hours, but as you say, choosing the books, you don't want it to be fully prescribed from on high, but if you've got teachers in their 20s who haven't developed a love of reading themselves, they need a little bit of help becoming the kind of teacher that Elaine and clearly you were, and someone that can communicate a love of literature to children, because it's cruel to deny them that love, I think.
Yes, and not to be afraid for teachers. I mean, it comes down to trust, doesn't it? So the teacher's trusting the head, so that they say, "I don't know what to teach. I actually don't really know how to read aloud well." And we would have training sessions where we would read aloud to each other, teacher to teacher.
Oh, that's interesting.
Supporting each other to improve how, and it's not about silly voices. No. It's not about having to put on all the accents. You can't, it's
quite like silly voices, but
they are fine if you can do them. But most of us can't.
Sure.
And so that kind of supportive environment will bring along reading in schools.
And yet, at the moment, of course, I mean, we've reminded ourselves, Tracy, haven't we, that head teachers are worrying about the roof caving in at the minute. So having the bandwidth, the resources, and even the time to address the kind of issues that you're talking about is looking close to a luxury. But you're bang on. Obviously, that is the scenario that we would like to see. Some suggestion from teachers still in the job, as opposed to Chasey and Elaine, who are both retired, that things have improved a little bit latterly. Reading for pleasure, especially in primary schools, is a key part of schools' Ofsted judgment for the quality of education. But even that description of it there somehow adds to the opposite point. You've got Ofsted somehow judging quality of education according to reading for pleasure. Can you even do that? And what are they reading for pleasure? Have they got a novel on the go with a chapter a day, teacher in front of the class, or are they doing what has been described to us and dealing chiefly with excerpts? Kate's been talking to her 13-year-old about it, and the 13-year-old tells Kate that there is definitely a focus on the technical aspects of a story rather than the creative and emotional sides. They've studied extracts from Shakespeare and Chaucer in Year 7, which was intimidating for many in the class and unlikely to encourage a love of books. He feels that the curriculum is set up for people who already love reading, and he says that happily as someone who is in that category and was inspired by the classwork. You can see that. I mean, I think Shakespeare can, with the right teacher, come alive for you at almost any age. Chaucer, I'd never got my head around Chaucer. I never really dug Chaucer, but doing it in, I guess it's on the curriculum, you have to do it in Year 7. But if these are your first introductions to grown-up books, it's probably going to do more harm than good. 11:30 is the time. Holly Harris is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 33 minutes after 11. I think we've got some footage of Rishi Sunak doing that. It wasn't me. Or are we just going to play a bit of Shaggy? This is the senior civil servant in the Department for Education describing how they went to the Treasury when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor and said we need funding for 300 to 400 schools and we've currently only got funding for 100, to which Rishi Sunak responded by saying, well, I'm going to cut it to 50 schools. You've heard so in fact, should we listen to the civil servant again? We'll listen to the civil servant again, Jonathan Slater, talking to the BBC this morning. Then we'll listen to Rishi Sunak's response, and you can tell me which one sounds most like an ostrich. So here's the former Permanent Secretary in the Department for Education, Jonathan Slater.
So it's frustrating, of course, when for you the most important thing is the priority to be given to safety. If the Treasury, of course, have got a concern that there's never enough money for everything, but we were able to present them with really good data. We weren't just saying there's a significant risk of fatality. We were saying there's a critical risk to life if this programme is not funded. While I was the Permanent Secretary in 2018, a concrete block fell from the roof of a primary school. So it wasn't just a risk, it was actually starting to happen. This spending review was completed a year after I left the department, and I was absolutely amazed to see that the decision made by the government was to halve the school rebuilding programme, down from 100 a year to 50 a year.
Good Lord. And here is Rishi Sunak in a pooled clip, which means everyone just has to use the same footage, responding to that accusation from somebody who may have an axe to grind after being removed from the post by, I think Dominic Cummings was responsible for that, but who certainly has nothing to gain and is very much breaching protocol or breaching precedent by coming forward with this account of events. Here's the current Prime Minister, then Chancellor, reacting to the suggestion that he is to blame for actions he took as Chancellor. I'll say that again in case you missed the sarcasm dripping from the description. Here is Rishi Sunak reacting to the suggestion that he's to blame for things he did when he was Chancellor, i.e. cuts to the school's rebuilding programme.
I think that is completely and utterly wrong. Actually, one of the first things I did as Chancellor in my first spending review in 2020 was to announce a new 10-year school rebuilding programme for 500 schools. Now, that equates to about 50 schools a year that will be refurbished or rebuilt. And if you look at what we've been doing over the previous decade, that's completely in line with what we've always done, about 50 or so schools a year refurbished or rebuilt. That's what I announced as Chancellor in my first spending review. On top of that, I also invested £5 billion to help our kids catch up with lost learning from COVID, the Education Recovery Programme. I think you'll remember at the time that was rightly a priority of the country to help our kids who've been disrupted by COVID with extra tutoring, for example, to help them catch up. And that cost £5 billion, which I invested in as Chancellor.
It's a bit like asking someone what the weather's like and they tell you what the time is. So he is accused of providing funding only for 50 schools per year to be refurbished, and he has completely and furiously rejected this accusation by revealing that he provided the funding for only 50 schools per year to be repaired at a time when civil servants were expecting 100 and asking for 300 to 400. I mean, it is now. I've said it to you a bunch of times, and obviously it's what my new book is about, so it's all very much in the forefront of my mind. But this absolute assault upon the truth is remarkable, and it always seems to go hand in hand with bogus ideology. In this case, we've learnt that the priority of free schools, the prioritisation of free schools, again, fetishization of the free market in all sorts of areas where it has no business being, contributing to Tory disasters, to Tory catastrophes, with 80% of the media going along with it. And speaking of the media, I think we might have our inaugural even. Should we do our inaugural Unhinged headline? I think we should. We've even got a jingle.
Unhinged headline.
Daily Telegraph, Monday the 4th of September 2023. 1 year on, we can see that Liz Truss got more right than wrong. Writes someone called Julian Jessup, described as an independent economist, but because it was my job to research this stuff for that book I just mentioned, I can tell you that he either is or until very recently was a fellow of, wait for it, the Institute of Economic Affairs.
Unhinged headline.
Back to the schools. I don't think Julie asks about interviewers following up. I think it's hard to do in pulled clips. I don't know. It depends who's doing it. I don't know who was doing it today, but you'd think someone might have pushed back a little bit on that. Eric is in Shrewsbury to steer us back to the conversation about the joys of reading. Eric, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. You said that you didn't think technology was a big part in this.
No, I didn't. Sorry. Crikey, you're making me sound pedantic now. I said that because we're mapping the decline from 2016, I didn't think technology per se, but we've mentioned the difference that TikTok poses in that field.
Yes, that was actually something I was going to drill down in more.
Good.
Was that in 2016, if you looked at the majority of social media, whilst it was still engaging, it was still predominantly short-form text. And so you had Twitter, you had your Facebook feed, you had whatever else, but it was predominantly text-based still. And so you could still switch between reading and your text-based social media, and it was still similarly in the same kind of content vein. Whereas now, if you look since then, every single platform you're on is pushing short-form video content. And that is sapping people. So it's like
changing your relationship with content.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I work in tech myself, and I have so many conversations with peers about, we know how addictive we're making these pieces of software. It's like the persuasive computing courses that go on, where you're actually taught in all the big universities now, when you're doing these computer science courses, you're taught how to make these pieces of software as addictive as possible so they keep them on. It's all about engagement time. It's all about...
Well, this is why some Silicon Valley sort of bro-skis have said they don't let their own children have access to the technology that they've made their fortunes giving to the rest of us.
I put rigorous time limits on my own phone as well, because I realize that even being cognizant of these things, I can go, oh, wow, I've lost this amount of time now to doing that. And I think it's really easy to do, even for people who know about it. And I think it's really pernicious, and it's going to
That's a great
really
word.
affect
I love that word.
Yeah.
There's a phrase for it, which I always forget. I get a proper mental block on it, but I discovered it when I was researching fixed odds betting terminals and the relationship between what you're describing, the way that the technology, but also the returns are set so carefully calibrated so that you keep putting more money in, you win just enough to make you keep putting money in. It's similar to that. It's obviously not the same, because this is only putting attention in as opposed to money, but the principle is probably the same. It's science, isn't it? It's physics. They're doing proper algorithmic research on our tiny little brains, on our children's tiny brains. What can we do about it? I mean, you've suggested putting limits in place for yourself, but here you've got 10, 11, 12-year-old children who are in danger of being denied the joys of reading for their entire lives unless action is taken pretty quickly.
I think I was in a very lucky position as a kid, but my screens were often taken away from me and I was forced to read. And so I certainly loved it. And I feel like more parents need to put in hard limits on the amount that their children, and I certainly will, if and when I get to the point of having my own kids.
Yeah, so good luck with that, Eric. I think I sounded like you once. I used to get on my high horse about tablets on long journeys.
My parents certainly endured, but
trust me, your parents didn't have the options that you're going to have if you do go down that path. We shall see. We shall compare notes 20 years hence and find out, because I don't think any of us managed to be quite the parents that we expected to be when it comes to the relationship with technology. I had my very, very first producer on LBC, Maxie Allen, his name was. He was a lovely, lovely bloke. And he used to get strangely worked up about things that weren't obviously things that you needed to get worked up about. And he took it very personally whenever people complained about children enjoying technology too much and not doing old-fashioned things. He'd quite rightly point out that video games are incredible. And the idea that people who didn't have video games when they were growing up, sitting there saying you should play fewer video games, it's just proof that you've never played video games. And this is going back 20 years, when games were nowhere near as sophisticated and as amazing as they are now. Why would you go outside and play soldiers with an old stick when you could literally sit in your sitting room with a nice drink next to you and a bowl of sweets and have an entirely immersive experience as if you were a real soldier, blowing actual things up in front of your actual eyes? And I know that there's room for both, but it used to always tickle me, the clarity with which he described football. I'm not very good at football, but I could get really good at FIFA. Why would I not want to play as Eric Cantona or Lionel Messi or Mo Salah or Ashley Hemmings? I always chuck Ashley Hemmings in at this point. Kidder Mr. Harriers. Why would I not want to play as them? Well, instead of going outside and ending up, tripping myself up with my own shoelaces again. I don't know, but I thank you, Eric. You're obviously right. I think that the pernicious, that's the word I'm borrowing from Eric, the pernicious nature of this technology, the way it is designed to draw you in the same way that adults are persuaded to put an entire wage packet into a fixed odds betting terminal. So children are persuaded to put an entire day, all their spare time, into an app. I suppose is it called an app? Into TikTok or into social media. It's coming up to 11:45. John's in Stroud. John, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Actually, I'm in a lay-by, so you might hear some traffic noise. I'm on the way to Oxfordshire. But I've seen this from two sides. Like your first couple of callers, I was a teacher when the literacy hour was introduced.
Okay.
I was actually a supply teacher in London. So, I've got memories from before the literacy hour was introduced of going into schools and, doing the teaching for the day and the kids saying, are you going to read us the next chapter of our story?
Yeah. You see it significantly as they do then?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And then I remember just a few weeks after the literacy hour was introduced, going into one of my regular schools, and they were looking at a picture book for their literacy hour in this classroom. And I said, right, literacy hour, and picked up the book, and they all went, oh.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But the thing is, of course...
What happened? What changed?
Well, the thing is, it wasn't just about reading and enjoying the story.
Okay.
It was about, let's look at the mechanics. I mean, I kind of used to compare it to, imagine somebody tells you they're going to teach you to drive. And then every morning for 7 years, they take you down to the garage, they flip open the bonnet, they say, this is the carburetor. This is the fuel pump. This is, and they're naming all the bits of the engine. By the end of 7 years, you can take an engine apart and put it back together again, but you can't drive.
No, that's an interesting way of looking at it. Helpful, I think.
Yeah,
and it was a conscious decision. It was a deliberate decision, which is part of the reason why literacy rates are going up. Reading proficiency is going up, but reading enjoyment is going down. How do we fix it, John?
How do we fix it? Well, I think we need to change reading cultures in a lot of schools.
Change it back almost.
Yeah. I mean, if you're in prison, you have a statutory right to a library. If you're in school, you don't.
Is that true? I did not know that.
It is. A lot of schools don't actually have libraries, and the Society of Authors. I used to be chair of the Children's Writers and Illustrators Committee, and we've been asking the government for a couple of decades now to make libraries in schools statutory.
Be careful, because you know what they'll do.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
They'll abolish the prison libraries just to make things fair again.
Don't give them ideas.
I'm not. You are. It's your fault. You say to the guy, "This is outrageous. You can have a statutory right to a library in a prison." Rishi Sunak will turn around and say, "Well, we've got to stop that. That's a terrible injustice. Close all the prison libraries immediately." What's your surname, John, for people who want to read your books?
It's Doherty.
Yes, I know.
And I should say I have gone into I go into schools as a visiting author, and I have to say visits haven't picked up for me and a lot of other authors since the pandemic. I'm not getting the same number of bookings.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I think that's a funding issue. I mean, you'll probably have lots of more popular authors than me phoning in now saying, "No, I'm getting just the same."
No, I'm sure. Let's say it's not. It can't possibly be personal. It can't possibly be personal. Not. Stink bomb and ketchup face. This is what the kids want, isn't it? Zeus on the loose.
Yes, absolutely. And
what's your most recent?
Nose and the hair-shaped hole.
Of course it is. We've spoken before. Thank you, John. I've got a crack on. You've taken me right up to break, which is just me pretending that we're in a school-based environment. And there are other children's authors getting in touch. Sophie, for example, has noted that the way writing is taught. Well, I'll tell you what she had to say after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 11:51. We'll catch up with this Labour mini reshuffle with Lewis Goodall in about an hour's time. But I can actually take the opportunity to tell you that two of the people most prominent in it, Angela Rayner and Lisa Nandy, have both been guests on the Full Disclosure podcast. And they're oddly, because I tend to get more excited about the sort of actors and the comedians and the authors than I do about the politicians, which is a big mistake on my part, because those are two of the most enjoyable. In fact, I mean, the political ones are always 10 times more enjoyable. I think it's because of the day job. So if it's we've got a politician scheduled to come in, it feels like an extension of the radio show. Whereas if you've got someone like Jack Whitehall coming in, or or Dale Vince actually was a brilliant one recently. It feels like a different. It feels like a. Do you see what I mean? But actually, the political ones are among the most popular of the whole series, and those two very much in that category. You can also, of course, hear the one with Keir Starmer, so you can always get a full house of everybody involved in today's reshuffle. Wes Streeting's there, although he's staying, I think, in his post at Health. 11:52 is the time. It's not only Rishi Sunak who's not responsible for the Conservative decision not to rebuild schools and therefore avoid the crisis that we're currently seeing up and down the country. It's also, judging by this ITV interview with the excellent Daniel Hewitt, it's also definitely not the Secretary of State for Education, Gillian Keegan's fault either.
It is not the job of the Department for Education, but we chose to do that because we wanted to make sure that we had that information centrally. On top of that, we wanted to...
on that, sorry. Yeah. A school collapsed.
Yes.
And it took you 4 years to send out questionnaires to find out how many schools had RAC.
No, we sent a warning out to the people responsible.
But you're saying that the government is not responsible, ultimately, for the safety of children in schools?
The school building's responsibility is with local authorities and multi-academy trusts.
Do you believe the government did everything in its power?
But we've taken it further now.
Do you believe the government did everything in its power, has done everything in its power, to make sure that children aren't being taught in schools that could collapse without warning?
Absolutely, because the responsible bodies have that duty. What we have done since is we have basically said we want to have more information centrally.
Well, I mean, I don't think you should be congratulated on that. I mean, there are literally children.
I'm not looking to be congratulated. I'm just saying what we have done.
There are literally children who've been going to school in buildings that could have collapsed. Children could have been seriously injured. Children could have died. And only now are you assigning caseworkers and money to sort this out.
No, the responsible bodies have always been responsible for making sure they have surveyors, making sure they look at things like asbestos, have an asbestos plan, RAC, etc. They have a responsibility for the maintenance of their buildings.
Don't forget that in a government or a country or a party where people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nadine Dorries can end up in the cabinet and people like Boris Johnson can end up Prime Minister, then nobody has to take responsibility for anything. They can all turn around and do a shaggy and say it wasn't me. It wasn't me. It wasn't me. And no one really, with the exception of the occasional journalist like Daniel there actually doing his job, nobody is going to say boo to a proverbial goose. Just before we go to Vanda, who's in Newhall, I'll just finish that message from Sophie, who, like John a moment ago, is a children's author. And she says, I've noticed that the way writing is taught in school bears no resemblance to the actual process as I experience it. Passing sentences in the way that children now have to kills creativity. Coupled with this, schools no longer have the budget for visiting authors. There you go, John. It's not just you, mate. Sophie's not getting invited into schools either. It's a crying shame, as nothing drums up enthusiasm for reading more than the magic of these visits. And there you go, another full disclosure plug, because Michael Rosen, of course, is one of the most popular children's authors when it comes to school visits, and he was a wonderful guest on Full Disclosure not long ago as well. So get yourself the Global Player and check out that archive. Vanda is in Newhall in Surrey to steer us back to the conversation about reading in schools. Vanda, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Long-time listener, huge fan, very nervous.
Oh, well, don't be. It's only me.
So, to give you some context, I'm a parent.
Yes.
I've got 3 boys. The oldest is 12, and they all have varying disability needs, SEN needs.
Yes.
Last year, I joined my son's primary school and become a learning support assistant in Year 6. And it was a real eye-opener in terms of reading. And I ended up having to run a guided reading support group for the children that were doing their stats. I should also say that I'm a huge book lover.
Right.
I've got my own library at home.
Lovely.
And I'm in a book club. So my opinion is that having the two experiences of being a parent and being in school is that I think that we're putting too much responsibility in schools.
Yes.
And really what we're asking is for schools to fix the problems that started at home.
I get that, and I know why you say it, but I don't worry about the children who are getting sorted at home. It's the ones that aren't being sorted at home that we need to address, and I don't know how you address them except at school.
But I think it's really important. See, children learn. The thing is, those children that don't have parents who read at home, who read to them.
Yes.
And nowadays, with technology, from your previous caller, what's happening is parents are pitching the book and actually just reading their phones. And it's really, and children learn by example, and they learn by example from a very early age. So when you get to school age, you know, it's the damage is already done, and you're asking teachers to kind of perform a miracle and really
Yes, that's true.
That.
No, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just sort of wondering what you do to help the child who isn't getting help at home.
Well, this is where it also gets a little bit more complicated,
Yes.
is because every child is different. So I've got 3 boys, and my youngest child, who's 7, absolutely adores reading, reads all the time. My middle son likes reading, doesn't like reading a book, but loves being read to, and really gets involved in the emotion and everything else with it. And my eldest, who of the 3 has more of the additional needs, he struggles to read. I mean, he's in the car right now, and I asked him, why don't you read? And he said, it makes me too tired, it's too much effort, because he's so used to the tablet giving instant kind of feedback and not having to make many decisions, that what he prefers is someone to read to him and for him to do something else while he listens. And this is where it goes back to the parents, because also the gender complicates matters, because with boys,
they like different things.
Well, they like different things, but it's certainly in my social circle.
Yes.
The women tend to read more.
Yes, of course.
And for boys, and when my son started school, the head teacher made it very clear that it's so crucial, because boys are falling behind girls in terms of reading. So it's crucial that they see male figures reading. And in particular, and that starts at home. So my husband, I've had to sort of say to him, you know, you need to read fictional books, and he does. He reads fictional books because and
come off the computer or come off the phone. You can't be what you can't see is one of my favourite phrases of the last few years that callers have introduced me to. You can't be what you can't see. So that's a really good point that you make, Vanda. You're really getting into your stride then. I feel bad about having to head towards the news, but time is upon us. What do you want to do next? I'm drawn to the story about body cameras in Tesco's. You know I have an enduring fascination with what it's like to be working in retail at the moment, but it's not the only option. There are a few others around as well. We've done 2 hours on education-based subjects already, so the reality of hygiene poverty, as reported by just around 3/4 of teachers now in British schools, may be a slight overload of matters educational. I shall consult my crack team of operatives during the head. Keith, you can take a few minutes off during the news.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I think actually we will turn our attention next to Scotland, where Humza Yousaf is starting to roll out a 4-day working week in the Scottish public sector. And the way the Telegraph reports it then adds the words, despite a looming £1 billion black hole. This is a subject about which I don't know much, but I'm pretty confident that the idea is that you get as much work done in 4 days as you would do in 5. And therefore, in terms of productivity, it just creates a better life. So the Telegraph reports that senior Scottish Government insiders have confirmed that the sort of Holyrood's version of the King's speech will include a 4-day week being introduced in parts of the public sector by the end of this year. They're looking at a 12-month pilot with some government enterprise agencies having expressed an interest in taking part. And if it is a success, then it could be rolled out far more widely within the SNP Green government. I mean, how do we do this? Because I don't know enough about it to offer up a view on whether it's a good idea or not. I think we might broaden it into changing working practices, because the whole working from home thing seems to be not in reverse. But do you remember what we said at the time? We said that everybody would be essentially hybrid. So anyone who was working 5 days a week at home was unlikely to be continuing to do so indefinitely. And anybody who was working 5 days a week in the office but would have quite liked to spend some time at home was highly likely to be able to do so. But certainly all of my research into a 4-day week has shown that it's actually very good for employer and employee alike. But I don't have any personal experience whatsoever to draw on. And perhaps problematically for our purposes during this hour, I don't know whether you do either. So what do we do? Just a broad conversation about the possibility of a 4-day week. How's it going to play in Scotland as well, where anyone earning more than £27,850 currently pays more income tax than if they lived south of the border? I imagine you look around at some areas of public service provision that are superior to those that we get in England and Wales, and largely think, well, that's all right, I can live with that. We haven't got everybody going out on strike every 10 minutes, but I could be wrong. There is, obviously, even as we talk about crumbling schools, the Tory conversation, the Tory internal conversation is essentially about tax cuts and whether Jeremy Hunt can bring them in sooner rather than later. I find that increasingly difficult to get my head around. But the story, which was first reported, I think, in the Herald yesterday, in the Herald on Sunday, is that Humza Yousaf is going to press ahead with Nicola Sturgeon's promise to trial a 4-day week and provide £10 million for companies who wanted to give employees a better work-life balance. That's the question. How have we ended up in this country in a place where it's not a question of feeling sceptical about something like this? It's how naive does it sound to say that government and business should be dedicated to making the lives of their employees better? One of the big changes I've undertaken while I've been doing this job is that idea that you kind of have a debt to your employer, and that you will work harder if you're like under pressure. I was taught that on Fleet Street. I was taught that in newspapers where everyone does ridiculous hours and drinks too much and does all their socialising with colleagues, and that idea that your productivity is linked to the number of hours that you spend in the office is actually wrong. It's actually not true. You can do much better work in completely different environments. You can do much better work in shorter packages of time. This idea that you're sort of here treading water or spinning wheels, I don't know that it's a really weird attitude. I don't know if it's post-industrial, because obviously if you're working in a factory, then in many ways your productivity is going to be linked to how much time you're spending at your post. But look, either talk me out of it or give me some reasons or give me some basis for continuing to believe it. I love the sound of a 4-day week. I don't think I'd ever get one because it's not the kind of job where that could be done. But if you've got an office-based job, how hard is it to cram 5 days worth of work into 4 days a week so that you get to have a 3-day weekend and spend more time with your family, or have a day off midweek? The Tories are very upset about it. Humza Yousaf is living in a fantasy land if he thinks this ridiculous plan is feasible. Says the Tory Finance Secretary Liz Smith. But here's a question I've actually been thinking about for ages, but I've never asked you before. Why do we still work as hard as our parents when we've got all this technology and we've got all this so-called help, computers and everything really? Look around you now. Why do we still work as many hours as our parents? Why aren't we doing fewer hours? I used to watch Tomorrow's World when I was a kid. Did you watch Tomorrow's World? I'm pretty sure that Tomorrow's World had conjured up an image of a world in which we would do less than previous generations had done. It's a sort of time management plus technology, and the mystery of why we find ourselves in this country. I don't know what other countries are like, but why we find ourselves in this country putting in shifts that are just as long and just as heavy, if you like, as the shifts that were put in by our parents' generation. Come at this from whatever angle you like. We've never done it before. We can do it now because the Scottish Government is not just contemplating it, but intending to introduce it. I think that there are problems on the horizon. If it is confined to the public sector, it'll be used as another opportunity to attack public sector workers, and that, of course, comes from the small state, libertarian, free market fetishists, and we've seen what a great job they do for the country when you let them into Downing Street. But it may be that I'm being naive, and it may be that a 4-day week, you're an employer, you find the idea of a 4-day week absolutely ridiculous. As far as I'm aware, there'll be people listening who've worked for other countries, for companies based in other countries. As far as I'm aware, it's usually found to improve the situation, but I don't have a full understanding of why that might be. Ash works for a Swedish company. 4-day weeks have been a thing for over a year now. Company productivity has increased. This is because it's implemented in conjunction with set meeting times and strict working hours. This is what we need, Ash. We need a proper explanation of what's going on. The mental and physical well-being of everyone has increased, which means everyone spends more time working and less time recovering or feeling stressed. How does that work? How does that work? How does it actually translate into efficiency and improvement on the ground? And in the context of Scottish politics, what will this particular intervention from Humza Yousaf mean? Hit the numbers now. You will go through. It's gone a bit bonkers already, the switchboard, which means I've either said something wrong or there's something wrong with the technology at the moment. I've either said the wrong day or the wrong time, and loads of people are ringing in to correct me, because I don't think I've framed the question yet in a way that would explain an avalanche of calls. But if I have, then go me. If I haven't, then just tell me why 4-day weeks routinely and or regularly improve productivity while simultaneously improving the mental health or the general equilibrium, the work-life balance of the employee. And then if you want to get philosophical about it, and I hope you do, where does the resistance come from? This is what I mean about me being on a journey. Is I used to think it was important to be stressed almost. It was a mark of professionalism or commitment. I'm not getting the language quite right on this, but I've explained it to you before. That idea that you owe a lot to your employer, and you've got to jump you've got to say how high when they say jump. Actually, younger people have taught me that there's room for improvement in that field. There's room for more balance, and that's where the phrase work-life balance comes from. So where does the English objection or the British objection come from? The objection to the idea that there is a duty of care from employer to employee, or that actually, if you're a really good employer, the welfare of your workforce should be a much bigger priority than it is. We hear a lot in this country about low productivity, and it's often to do with a failure to invest in infrastructure and a failure to invest in research and development, shareholders taking out huge dividends and huge payouts rather than investing in the future. But I wonder whether it's linked to this as well. You know, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng and Dominic Raab and the rest of them wrote that book describing British workers as being among the laziest or the most idle in the world. It was a remarkable precursor to political careers that went all the way to the very top. And I never liked it, because you look at people working and you know that they're not lazy, but they're not getting as much done as counterparts in other countries. And those are countries where the infrastructure has been invested in, or the working experience has been made more efficient. I don't know why this country feels like a place where we give too much weight to the employer on the question of what should and should happen in the workplace, and not enough weight to the worker. Do you recognise that? Does that make sense to you? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. So I want to know about the reality of a 4-day week, either from theorising or from personal experience. But I also want to know about, the predictable pushback. You know that there will be resistance to this. Rather than saying, show me the research, let's look at the figures, let's find out what works and try and figure out why. And let's also remember that as an employer, then the welfare of my workforce should be, right up there with the amount of money that I'm going to make next year. I want to have a happy workforce, fulfilled, unstressed, mentally well, mentally healthy. That should be a real priority. Getting to spend more time with your family for most of us would be a really good thing. Where does this Anglo-Saxon pushback come from? This immediate, because that's why the Telegraph are reporting it. You know that this sort of high church Tory ideology will hate this idea because ... Because what? Because why? Because people should know their place? Because workers should be grateful for the job that they... Where does it come from? This resistance to the idea that making work more pleasant for workers is a win-win situation for everybody. Hit the numbers now. You will get through. I have got a couple of phone lines free now. 0345 6060 973. Jackpot, of course, is somebody who's already had experience of a 4-day week and what that's actually like.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
18 minutes after 12 is the time. 4-day week. What's not to like? 0345 6060 973. I could have just done that at the top of the hour. Save my voice a bit for the audiobook I've got to record after this. 3 days it's going to take. I'm not doing it in 3 days successively, but 3 days. 3 days sitting in a darkened room listening to the sound of my own voice. Oh, sounds like heaven. Luana is in Reading. Luana, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I've been a fan of the 4-day work week, or the idea of it, ever since it was introduced in, common media, and especially during the pandemic, we've seen a bit of an increase in, workers' rights movement, and why are we working so hard as we do for as little money as we get? And
is that so? You see it as part of that process, or you see it as part of people working less hard? Whereas I was drawn to the idea that it actually improves productivity.
It does improve productivity. I agree, because it's been all over the research that it's not harmful for companies. It seems to be, to me, connected with the amount of control that your employer wants to exert over you.
Yes, of course.
Like, if they can't see you working, that's the same thing for returning back to the office. If they can't see you working, are you actually working?
That's really interesting. So it's about almost the personality type of an employer or a boss or a manager, actually, more likely to be someone that's risen or been promoted through the ranks rather than somebody who has set something up from scratch. They almost relish the power, as it were.
I think so, and I've seen it with
my spouse, for example, he's in finance, and finance has always been very, like working long hours, working hard hours. And his superior is of the opinion that he needs to start at 8, he needs to finish at 8, and he needs to do that at 5 times a week.
Yes.
And it's a hard life, because if you push back on it, then you're the lazy person.
Do we know why things improve? Why? Because I'm looking, 70 companies in Britain have actually tried this. The New York Times reported on it not that long ago, September of last year. Most of the companies who participated in the pilot said they'd seen no loss of productivity during the experiment, and in some cases had seen a significant improvement.
Yeah,
Do we know why?
Can't tell you.
No,
I can't tell you why they don't believe the research. I mean, this is not the first time in history that we're confronted with the truth, and they decide, something else is right for us.
No, but do we know why the research holds true? Do we know why the 4-day week is improving productivity? What is it? What changes?
If I think about myself, I would think that because I have, if I think about my weekend, my Saturday is full of, I'm cleaning the house, I'm going shopping, I'm doing this, I'm doing all of my admin life on Saturday because I have to. I can't do it during the week because I'm too busy actually working. If I have an extra day to relax, then, You're
going to come into work bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and do more and move through your work more, at least to start with. I mean, there was a lot of talk about home working, remote working improving productivity in the early days of lockdown, but I think by the end things had evened out. I didn't know about this pilot. Thank you, Luana. That's a perfect start. Did you know about this pilot? Why am I reading about it in the New York Times when it is an experiment in Britain? That's September of last year. It was about halfway through. They published the research, as I say, last September. 73 companies get a paid day off every week. 35 of the 41 companies that responded said they were likely or extremely likely to consider continuing it beyond the end of the trial, which ended at November last year. All but 2. So 2 out of the 41 companies said productivity was either the same or had improved. So 39 out of 41 companies said it had either stayed the same or improved. 6 out of 41 companies said it had significantly improved. I don't know why that would be, or indeed why there would be a resistance to it, like a knee-jerk resistance to it, except that idea that what's the point of being a boss if I don't get to boss people about all day? Adam is in Henley. Adam, what would you like to say?
Good morning. Good afternoon. I'm behind the times. On the 4-day week piece, I just find it incredibly difficult to believe that research, and I'd be really interested to read more deeply into it. Maybe if it was over a short period of time, people are enthusiastic about the scheme and they give more. I had a business that I sold out in September 21. We operated during COVID, and when people started working from home, we had an uplift in productivity because people basically gave us their commute time. So the time they would have normally started on their commute, they fired up their laptops and they started working. But over the months, that started to decay, and eventually we could see the log-on times. People were logging on at the time they would have normally got to the office rather than the time they'd have gone onto a car or a train. I don't know, but logic tells you that
it doesn't.
That's
I don't know that it does, because I get that. That's them giving you time that you weren't really paying them for, isn't it? And then realising the longer it went on that they were daft for doing that. If you'd offered to pay them for the hours that they were doing extra, then they probably would have carried on doing them.
Possibly, but my point was
it was
novel.
It's not
and
possibly,
new,
mate.
And they were feeling
how much work do you do unpaid?
None.
So why should they?
Well, it was voluntary. We didn't ask them to do it. I'm just telling you it's a phenomenon.
No, I know, and I'm explaining to you why it tailed off. But, you're the boss.
Yeah, okay. Well, not anymore. So, so for me, I'd question things like, how can a receptionist have the same level of productivity over 4 versus 5 days? Not possible, because they're not actually showing up for one of the days.
No, but I don't know whether receptionists are included in the indicative research gathered by 4-day week global. Where does your sort of emotional objection come from, do you think?
Well, I don't have an emotion.
No, it must be emotional, because there is some evidence, and I grant you it's not infallible. It's good enough for the New York Times to have reported it in some depth, but you it's an emotional response to not want to believe evidence. That's not an intellectual response. It's a sort of scepticism born of an emotion. I'm wondering what that emotion might be.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with you. I started the call by saying I would like to examine the evidence more carefully because,
No, you said you don't believe it. Is how you began the call by saying you don't believe the evidence.
Yeah, I find it hard to believe.
That's an emotional response. That's an emotional response. My emotional response is that I want it to be true, and that's an emotional response. It's not, I can't back it up intellectually until I've dug into it more. Your emotional response is to not believe it, to almost want it not to be true. I'm just wondering where we think that comes from.
Well, no, I want it to be true. I think something for nothing is a beautiful thing for anyone, right?
It's not something for nothing. It's not something for nothing, is it? It's more for the same.
Well, you're paying people not to work.
Yes, you are, but you're paying people not to work, but to do the same amount of work that they did in a different amount of time. So think of it as spreading butter on a slice of toast. You've got the same amount of butter. You're just going to have either more on the toast or less on the toast, depending on how it's spread about.
Well, except that if I understood what you said correctly, there's more butter.
What do you mean there's more butter? Yes, even more butter. You end up with even more butter.
That's what I'm saying, which is the something for nothing.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, maybe. So what would the proof be for you? Because you'd need to see it in place for 2 or 3 years or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not even that. Are these studies over a quarter, 2 quarters? Just a decent period of time where the novelty's worn off, people are into their daily routine, and they genuinely are delivering effectively more for the same amount of pay, which would be fantastic.
And then everyone's a winner.
Obviously.
The World Economic Forum have done quite a lot on it. And, of course, the companies in other countries where it has become the new normal would probably be the best place to look for that. But yeah, you mean you're going to have another divide again, as Adam reminds us. It's not fair on the receptionist who's going to have to go to work every day if the people who are working in the offices upstairs are managing to squeeze their work. There's jobs you can't do, isn't there? That can't do more work in less time because the job involves being there, literally physically being there, as in meet and greet or front of house or customer facing, whatever you want to call it. Sean's in Finchley. Sean, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Yeah, big fan. I don't know why, but I'll do my best.
No reason.
So I work in tech. I work full-time for video game companies. I have done for almost the better part of a decade now. And so one of my previous employers,
yes.
Has been one of those 70 companies you mentioned in the UK that trialled the 4-day work week.
Oh, really?
So many of my colleagues, previous colleagues and friends,
yes,
still work there and have experienced that. So, yeah, that's what I call them.
I just noticed, looking through the list of some of the companies that are on it, and just as I got to the end of that completely random spiel about customer-facing experiences, I've just noticed that one of the companies is Platton's Fish and Chips in Wells next the sea, which is one of my favourite fish and chip shops in England, and very much a place that would be customer-facing. So it does seem to apply to everybody. It is as if, you're getting paid for a 5-day week. You'd get the same amount of money for a 4-day week, but you would also include jobs where I would have presumed you couldn't do that, as in jobs where you need to be physically there to do the job at all. What was the experience of your mates? What was the general consensus?
Well, if I could say, so over the course of the pandemic, where everyone's lives, of course, have changed, you've gone from a 5-day work week in an office, in some places very expensive offices, housing maybe 200, 300 plus people. So to justify that and bringing people back from full-time remote work, then there's the incentive. Well, if you come back to work 4 days a week in the office, so it gives people that freedom of choice. Because so many recruitment companies, particularly in tech and in my sector, they were fully remote positions that were just going off the shelf as soon as they would be listed. So they were very, very valuable. So companies would then have to offer something else. So, well, if you want to come back, we feel like we could give you that 4-day work week.
So you've got a freedom of choice. And do we know why it might be the case that, a proportion of these companies are reporting an improvement in productivity? Why might that be?
So perhaps my observation, but I could be wrong.
Yeah.
If you look at it in 1 week, just with 1 week, of course, 5 is more than 4. You'll do more work in 5 than you will in 4. But if you look at it in the round, and I think over the course of a longer period of time, I think productivity in the office, if I'm speaking to what my experience would be, you might be more productive,
I think,
or just as equivalent to the 5 days at home. So that's perhaps their analysis. I don't know. But
fewer
I'll
distractions.
take a 4-day work week if it gives me the extra, because then I can have a third day, of course, my weekend, dedicated to whether it's my own business or
yes, of course, or spending time with your family,
or looking after my family.
Of course, exactly, all sorts of things. I'd love a 3-day week, a 4-day week actually. I'd love a 3-day weekend, but I don't think Keith would be able to cope. It's 12:30. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:33 is the time. The politicians are back at work, which means, of course, that we have a duty to contemplate their shenanigans on a daily basis. Lewis Goodall, star of the newsagents, joins me now to have a look at what Keir Starmer has been up to today, and possibly at what Rishi Sunak and Gillian Keegan have been up to as well. And to knit those two stories together, was there a case for Keir Starmer pausing this reshuffle while the Tories found themselves in such self-inflicted trouble?
Yeah, there was. I mean, for the very simple reason that obviously until the government puts its top team together in full, probably not the full pre-election cabinet, but something close to it, obviously the argument had been Starmer had kept delaying this because you don't quite know who you're matching with whom.
Man-to-man marking.
Well, quite, exactly. But I think the feeling among the Labour leader's office was simply that, this was being deferred and deferred and deferred and deferred. And you might as well get this out of the way, particularly pre-conference, because, of course, this could be, probably is, the last conference before the general election, although I still think my money is on December next year, so it probably won't be. But nonetheless, it could easily be the case. So you want to have something as close to the team that you're taking into the general election as possible before conference, and so we're seeing all of these moves today.
It's bigger than perhaps people expected.
Yeah.
There's a lot of movement here.
There's quite a lot of movement, yeah. I mean, the top three jobs, Shadow Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary, they look like they're going to be staying where they are, which wasn't necessarily going to be the case a few months ago. There was a lot of speculation about Yvette Cooper, maybe even David Lammy as well, but they're staying where they are. But below that, it's a really big transformation or a big set of changes. And, someone just texted me basically saying, this is the bonfire of the soft left.
What does that mean?
It means the kind of, I suppose Lisa Nandy is kind of probably the best representative of this. The people on the wing of the party who are not the sort of Corbynite left-wingers, but there's always been this slightly amorphous group within the Labour Party faction called the soft left. Not Blairite, not Corbynite, if you want to put it as simply as that.
Sure.
Somewhere in the middle. And we've seen Starmer, both in terms of his policy, arguably, but also in terms of his the people around him and his personnel, increasingly move and take people from people on what can still broadly be described as the Blairite wing of the party. And you're seeing people who are maybe not quite in that faction, i.e. like Lisa Nandy, being slowly moved out. And it's a big demotion for Lisa Nandy, really. I mean, you consider, she's going to be Shadow Development Minister, which isn't even its own cabinet position anymore, of course. And
although
she
it probably
herself,
would be under Labour.
Well,
but
although
that's
that
not
hasn't,
the point,
probably, but you can't be certain of that. But also, remember, of course, until not so long ago, she was Shadow Foreign Secretary herself.
Yes,
she will now be effectively the number 2 to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy.
Yes. And I mean, movements at culture, movements at Shadow Secretary of State level, work and pensions, culture, a lot more. We should talk about Angela Rayner first, shouldn't we? Where does she fit on that?
Well, she would definitely
scale.
be on the soft left, but of course you can't move Rayner out of the shadow cabinet.
You can't stop her being deputy leader.
You can't stop her
she's
being
elected
deputy
to that role.
Quite so. Yes. So she has just as much a mandate as Starmer does within the Labour Party's rules, so you can't get rid of her. I mean, theoretically, you could not have her, I suppose, potentially in the shadow cabinet, but that would create all sorts of problems and eruptions potentially. So she is moving from shadow cabinet office. I think there was also a feeling that, look, Rayner is a very, very effective media performer. As LBC listeners will know, she's been on this station many times. She's been with you, James. And she's very, very effective. There are tensions between her and Starmer's office. You're always told that they get on well enough personally, quite well personally, but doubtless there are tensions, as there inevitably always are. But there is also a recognition that, look, it would be better for her to be in a fully fledged domestic brief where she can be out on the airwaves, doing that kind of Grant Shapp role in a way, sort of speaking for the leader's office and levelling up.
What's his role this week?
Well, his role this week is being sort of, getting out on the airwaves as a sort of effective communicator, fluent communicator is what they say about him. And sort of get her to do that rather than be stuck in a slightly drier role around Cabinet Office, which is a bit more kind of constitutional, and it's a little bit more kind
and
of
levelling
stories
up plays to all of those strengths.
Levelling up plays to those strengths. So that's the idea behind that.
So she's now toe-to-toe with Michael Gove.
Indeed so, which will be an interesting match-up in the Commons. I mean, there are lots of...
And it's a promotion, we should be clear. She emerges with more power than she began the day.
Yeah, probably. It's certainly not a demotion.
No.
It's certainly, it's
Which
not a demotion.
people were speculating.
Yeah, exactly. So, but there are... there is a lot of movement. I'm just looking through now. It's just been announced that Hilary Benn is returning to the Shadow Cabinet as Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary. Peter Kyles is going to be he's going to be Science and Innovation, Technology. Tangam Debonair is going to be Culture, Media and Sport. I mean, these are all people who, for people who are very who follow politics closely, these are the people that you will see on this station and elsewhere regularly batting for Keir Starmer, that the leader's office trusts.
Yes.
And that is what Starmer is doing now. He's placing these key lieutenants in all of the kind of, for want of a better expression, public-facing briefs that he wants to be sort of on the airwaves in the run-up to the general election, which is probably now a year or so away.
And a bit of talent spotting as well. Darren Jones has done very well at committee level. He's caught our eye a couple of times, actually, with his questioning at committee level, and he comes in to a juicy new job. Yeah,
Shadow Chief Secretary Rosina Allen-Khan, who's the Shadow Mental Health Minister, has left the Shadow Cabinet. Because this is one of the more sort of testy exchanges of letters. She's written to him saying that Starmer had made clear on the phone some weeks ago that, quote, "You do not see a space for a mental health portfolio in a Labour cabinet, and this is why I told you many weeks ago that I would not be able to continue in this role."
So they are feels that the role should have more kudos.
Well, the Shadow Cabinet had sort of become very large, so I think the idea was to try and trim it a little bit going into the general election to make it less unwieldy. But there are people, as of right now, like Lucy Powell, who was at Shadow Culture, who currently don't have a job because that has been filled by someone else. So there are a couple of people at the moment kind of floating around.
Waiting to find out. It's interesting, the Rosina Allen-Khan story, because it's reported today that the majority of voters think the government is failing on mental health, with the issue set to become a key theme at the next general election. So Starmer may have cause to regret that prioritisation.
Perhaps. Ed Miliband is obviously the one that lots of people will be watching as well.
Yeah, why is that, Lewis?
Well, because, as you'll know, James, one of the themes of the summer has been...
Very kind. I thought it's more than likely that I don't.
We're just trying to butter you up, as you know. As you know, being such an august and eminent man, James.
Thank you. Yes, of course.
Ed, one of the themes of the summer has been around sort of green policy, ULEZ and so on. And there has absolutely been tension between Starmer's office and Miliband, partly around the policy on North Sea oil and gas, which some in Starmer's office, including Pat McFadden, who has just been promoted to the Shadow Chancellor Duchy of Lancaster role, Cabinet Office role, were pretty furious. They were annoyed. They felt that this was an own goal, that it gave the Tories something to sort of alight on, that they were going to run on this idea of oil and gas and Labour not being interested in exploiting our own resources, blah, blah, blah. Whatever you think about that, they felt that it was an own goal. And there is a feeling among some in Starmer's office that having Miliband, who, whatever his virtues, and he's a thoughtful man, he's an interesting politician in lots and lots of ways, there are some who believe that having someone in such a senior post in the Shadow Cabinet who is so recognised and sort of associated with the past and ultimately, let's be honest, defeat in the 2015 general election just isn't a very good idea, and the Tories will try and exploit that. So there is a feeling around that. But then again, Starmer and Miliband personally have been close. There are those who say that Miliband is the one who basically persuaded Starmer to run for Parliament in the first place. So that has sort of gelled Miliband's place in the Shadow Cabinet. But that'll be one of the most interesting things at the end of the day, will be to see whether Miliband remains in place or not.
It is going to continue, is it, for several hours?
For a few more hours, I think,
Because as you say, there are people who don't know whether they're going to have any job at all. Hilary Benn back in the Cabinet, as you mentioned, and then the new names.
Well, what's interesting, James, I suppose we should say, is that this is generating so much interest. It tells you something, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
I mean,
the
fact of the matter is there was the sort of mini reshuffle last week in the Cabinet with the Energy Secretary and Shapps and so on. And of course it generated interest, and of course it was a more modest change. But you know what? This is actually generating so much more interest by comparison, to some extent even to that, but also than you would ever normally expect in a Shadow Cabinet reshuffle. And that tells you something, in a sense that everybody is expecting that in a year's time or so, this won't be the Shadow Cabinet, this will be the Cabinet, and this will be the people making decisions about all of our lives. So this isn't one just for Westminster watchers like these things normally would be. This is actually something that potentially has a great deal of import going into that general election and then beyond it.
And I mean, it gives Starmer perhaps subconsciously the kudos of leading a government in waiting then as well, what you describe. Just a quick word before the break on the school story, the way it's unfolding this morning. Both Rishi, you heard the interview on Radio 4 with Jonathan Slater, the former Permanent Secretary of the Department of Education. That was actually, I mean, I know we're always talking about people talking about things, but that was notable. It was a departure from the norm, wasn't it?
You don't normally hear former Permanent Secretaries, former very senior officials within departments talking like that and pinpointing blame effectively, so explicitly on the person who is now the Prime Minister, who was Chancellor at the time. Obviously, Slater left in particular circumstances. The Johnson government was no fan of him. That's why he basically ended up being forced out of the Department for Education. But nonetheless, look, this is I was talking to a Labour person over the weekend, and they were saying, this couldn't be a better start. I mean, it couldn't be a worse start to the school year, but it also, in a way, couldn't be a better start for the Labour Party in the political year. Because, how could you craft a story when one of Labour's principal arguments is nothing is working, the whole country is falling apart, they've had 13 years to sort it and they haven't. And then quite literally, as millions of parents getting their kids back to school for the new year, they're suddenly worried that not only are the schools going to be any good, or what's going to happen with their exams, or all of this sort of stuff, whether their kids are going to catch up on COVID, they're literally now worried, and whatever the government says about whether it's proportionate or not is sort of beside the point in political terms. All of these people are now worried whether literally the roofs on their kids at school are going to stay up.
Yeah.
And that just feeds into that narrative completely perfectly. And, I think in a way, and we saw the Rishi Sunak clip earlier today, and he was saying, which in many ways is a perfectly valid point, say, look, 95% of schools we think are unaffected. There are 22.5%. But then you're thinking,
on Monday,
okay, but that's 5%.
On Tuesday, nobody.
Well, exactly. I think a better line from number 10, which I think they might have to affect or bring into effect by the end of the day, is one is one too many.
Yes, exactly.
And, at the end of the day, whether it's 5% or 15% or 1%, that is still, dozens and dozens of schools, potentially scores of schools, and thousands of kids and parents who are caught up in it. And it is,
and it's not going anywhere, is it?
It's not going anywhere. I think the worry number 10 will be by the end of the week. Yeah. We're not just talking about this with regards to schools, hospitals, other public buildings as well.
And of course, it's in the spotlight now. So actually, if a roof collapsed, a ceiling came in on a classroom in Kidderminster 3 months ago, it would not be national news.
Yeah.
If a ceiling comes in on a classroom in Kidderminster today, it's probably leading the news.
It reminds me of when a government gets to the point which potentially is the end game. It's like it's nothing, no matter what it does. Things that normally, with a government that was in robust political health, sort of are passed by and don't get that much attention. You remember when the dying days of Brown, when they lost the tax disc, for example? Yeah. Not sure that had much effect over the long term on anybody, but it felt like every single day brought a new catastrophe, a new sort of plague of locusts. And the danger is that is how it starts to feel before the party conference.
Lewis Goodall, always a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. 12:45 is the time. Back to the question of 4-day weeks after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:49. I worked in Scandinavia for a decade, from 8 till 4 every day, flexible days off, less stress, less sickness, healthier colleagues, more focused, happier work environment. The UK worker, in comparison, is overstressed, sicker, pressured, which leads us to make mistakes and taking pride in the long hours that we work. It's time to reassess. I really think it is, actually, but hey-ho, what do I know? I only do 15 hours a week, plus audio book recordings. Rita's in Surbiton. Rita, I'm so sorry to keep you. What would you like to say?
No, James, I just wanted to echo what you just actually read out.
Oh.
Because I have done both. I've worked 5 days a week and I've done the 4-day a week. And when I did the 4-day a week, I was more motivated and I was basically physically and mentally much more better. I was absolutely physically and exhausted working 5 days a week, looking after children and elderly parents, because you've got to understand lots of workers now have elderly parents to look after as well.
Oh, yes, I hadn't thought of that.
And so I was physically and mentally much better, in a much better place working those 4 days. But even though I worked harder on those 4 days, I worked longer hours. It's not that I didn't do the time that I would have done on the Friday anyway, because I was so motivated because I wanted that extra day.
You only really need to do an hour and a half more on the 4 days, don't you, to sort of bring it up.
And you're still equally productive.
Why were you more motivated? And would it not wear off with time?
No, James, I was grateful.
Yeah, but gratitude is a finite resource. It peters out. You after 5 years, you're not going to feel grateful for not doing what.
Yeah, I did. I worked.
No, you didn't. Don't fib to me.
No, great. You are grateful, James. When you see other people working 5 days a week and not getting that extra day off.
So you're comparing yourself to them
grateful.
rather than comparing yourself to the old you, because that's where the first bit of gratitude comes from. The fact that you're not doing what you used to do. But that means that if everyone's on a 4-day week, then it will peter out a bit. You will be less grateful.
Yeah, I understand what the point you're making, but physically and mentally, you'll still be better off
because you've had more time for yourself.
Yes.
I think you're probably right.
It works for the company, it works for the wide economy, and it works for the employee.
Yeah, the more you think about it, the more logical it becomes. Actually, it's a very English thing, isn't it, to think that you're only really working hard if you're under stress and knackered all the time.
Well, James, all the MPs, the amount of holidays they get, they still manage to run the country.
Well, you say that.
I'm sure the companies will keep going.
Yeah, they clock off on Friday. They're off. Oh, you ever want to bump into your MP? Go into first-class railway trains on Fridays. Friday lunchtime. That's where you'll find them. 12:52 is the time. Pete's in Plymouth. Pete, what would you like to say? Thank you, Rita.
Hey, James.
Hello, Pete.
What I wanted to say was it depends on what you measure.
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
So if we take you as an example, right? If you were to do a 4-day week, you would probably do less hours on the radio.
Yeah.
But if we were to measure, I don't know, the way you educate people and the way you train people to do critical thinking, then having more time to consider that and less time on the radio might actually.
I think you should have picked a different. How dare you? What do you mean improve my output? I think you should have picked a better. Improve your. I suppose you'd go to the Louvre, do you, and think, I know what that Mona Lisa needs. It just needs a little bit of a touch up in the corner, and then it'll be absolutely perfect. Improve my output. I don't know what you're talking about, but you're right.
Depends on what you measure.
Yes, it does depend what you measure, and bosses arguably measure different things from workers.
Yeah, and that's called the theory of managerialism, which is that managers measure what is easy to measure.
No, I've never heard that before, but I like it.
And that's when you look at this 4-day week through what is easy to measure, it's a real problem. But if you look at it through the lens of someone who works in the knowledge economy, then actually having more space and time and less meetings that you don't really need to go to probably gives you more time to think about the stuff you think about. Well, me, for example, I work in tech.
Right.
And I don't stop thinking about work at the weekend, not because I hate it, but because it's interesting.
Yes, because what's engaged your mind during the week, you don't switch it off. So I'm the same, actually. When I'm not here, obviously, I'm thinking about, talking about stuff. So do you currently have a 5-day week?
Currently have a 5-day week, yeah.
Do you think your
bank holiday? I thought was it June where we had almost a bank holiday every week?
Yeah.
That was just barbaric.
Why?
Well, because the meetings didn't stop. So all the meetings were compressed into 4 days.
Oh, okay.
So there's more to this than just cutting the day off.
It's not a question of just chopping that bit off and thinking everything will slot into place. You have to change the way you approach almost everything. Thank you, Pete. Nicely put. I shall take away the suggestion that we could somehow improve the output of this programme. That's certainly not something I've heard before. It's coming up to 5-1. Holly's in Colchester. Holly, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello,
Hello. I just wanted to say I actually do work 4 days a week. I do compressed hours, so I work full-time hours.
There it is.
Yes, so I did 13 years doing 5 days a week. And in the last year, I have compressed my hours to do 4 days a week. And my whole way of working and way of actually living my life has improved tenfold just through having my day off.
Can I ask what you do?
So I'm a healthcare provider in Essex. We provide medical consumables and equipment.
So all the measures by which your productivity could be judged have not deteriorated and have in some cases improved.
So they have definitely improved because it's actually reinvigorated my outlook on work. I'd become quite sort of stale, to use an odd way of
Hang on a minute,
wording
Keith, pay attention. Stale, quite stale, you say, Holly. Interesting.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes, just because obviously I think it's very easy when you're working 5 days a week to get very caught up in the fact that actually you work more than you live.
Yeah.
You see your work colleagues far more than you see your partner.
That's true.
And I personally found it made me quite anxious in the way of I felt all my personal relationships were struggling, but yet my work relationships were thriving.
Gosh. Did you ask for it? Did they announce that it was something you could apply for? How did it transpire?
I actually just requested it. I put myself first and said, I love my job. I don't want to leave. As I say, I've been with the company for coming up to 15 years.
Yeah.
And it was just something that I'd been sort of mulling over for quite a while to see if it would work and if it is something that actually, if it's a hindrance, fine, I'd go back to 5 days a week.
Right. But it's worked out really well. And your employer would say the same, would they, if they were here?
Yes. I mean, he's upstairs.
Everybody's happy with it.
They are. And as I say...
He's not called Ned, is he?
No.
Because I've got a Ned in Colchester on line 2. That's 2 calls from Colchester at the same time. We've already had coincidences galore today. And so you gave them a proper plan and said, I'll do this and that the 4 days will involve this. The 4 days that I do now are not the same as the days when I did 5. They are different days. I do different. Yes. I approach things differently. I do different amounts of work in different ways.
Yes. So I start at 7 o'clock, finish at 5. Yep. Structured my job role as best as I felt I could, and my manager completely agreed with it.
Love it.
Far better.
And are you on? Oh no, you're not on your day off today either.
No, I am working. I've taken my little lunch to make this call.
Oh, well, I tell you, I'll take it all back. Thank you. Because I was thinking if it freed you up to make this call, it would have been win, 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 win. Ned in Colchester, I'll give you 1 minute, Ned. What would you like to say?
Well, this is the reason why we should do a 4-day working week, because we get to listen to you all day. That's the best part, isn't it?
Very true, yes. Yes, this is true.
Very true.
Is that it? Is that what you rang in to say? I mean, I've got no problem with it whatsoever.
No. So I've got a small anecdote for you. Bill Gates said that he gave the laziest people in Microsoft the hardest jobs to do because they would find the quickest way of doing them, which I thought was total genius.
Did he use the word lazy?
Yes, I believe he did.
Because that's unfair. That's unfair, isn't it? Because I like the earlier caller talking about thinking time. You might not look like you're doing a lot, but you're thinking hard.
But so what I rang to say was because people, as Pete said before, about how do you yardstick productivity, right? If you're judging someone that sorts parcels.
Yeah, so that's what he talked about, the knowledge-based economy. You can't count the widgets that I did warn you. I didn't have much time, Ned, but I'm glad that we got the chance to touch base. That's it from me for another day. You can hear it all. Well, not the same thing, although some days it probably. We could do that one week, Keith. We should play out a show from a couple of weeks ago, see if anyone notices. If you missed any of today's show, which was all live and real, I promise, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also rewind live radio. You'll also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as the world's biggest podcasts. Rewind live radio on Global Player. Download it for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.